Hello everyone, welcome back. It's the storyteller here to guide you into a peaceful sleep. Before we get started, please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, where are you tuning in from and what time is it there? Drop your answers in the comments below. Now, make yourself comfortable and let's unwind together. Story 1. The rain hadn't stopped for days. It drummed against the windows, a constant, unrelenting sound that filled the silence of Marla's apartment. It was the kind of downpour that turned streets into rivers and made the world feel smaller, closed in. The town had been growing quieter with each passing night. Fewer people on the streets, shops closing early, conversations whispered instead of spoken. Marla told herself it was just the dreariness of the weather, but deep down, she knew better. She first saw the figure 3 nights ago. It stood beneath the streetlight across from her apartment, motionless in the rain. At first, she thought, it was just someone caught in the storm, but the way it stood so still, not shifting or shivering, made something in her stomach tighten. She watched it for a long time, waiting for it to move, to prove it was just a late-night wanderer, but it never did. When she finally looked away and back again, it was gone. The next night, it was there again. And this time, it was closer. Tonight, she told herself she wouldn't look. She would shut her blinds, turn off the lights, and ignore the heavy weight of unease pressing against her ribs. But something inside her wouldn't let it go. As she stood by the window, breath held, she lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to see outside. The figure was there, closer than before, just standing, just watching. Marla let the curtain fall and took a step back. The air in her apartment felt thick, like the pressure before a storm. The hum of her refrigerator in the kitchen sounded louder than usual, the ticking clock on the wall suddenly unbearable. She tried to shake it off. It was just some weirdo, just someone standing in the rain. But as she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the knock came. A slow, deliberate knock. Not the kind of knock a friend would use, not the kind of knock meant to be answered. Marla lay frozen in bed, the knock still echoing in her ears. It hadn't been loud, but something about it felt deliberate, patient. She held her breath, waiting for a second knock, a voice, some confirmation that it was just a neighbor, a mistake, someone lost in the rain. But nothing came. Just the steady rhythm of water against glass and the faint hum of the city beyond the downpour. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers stiff with unease. The screen glowed too brightly in the dark, making her wince. No missed calls, no texts, just the time, 3:13 a.m. The knock had come at exactly 3:12. Slowly she sat up, listening. The apartment felt different, too still, as if the knock had pushed the entire space into some deeper silence. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet pressing into the cold hardwood floor. For a long moment, she debated, ignoring. It, whatever it was, whoever it was, they were gone now. But the weight in her chest told her she wouldn't be able to sleep until she checked. Padding softly toward the door, she pressed her eye to the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, stretching in both directions beneath the flickering yellow glow of the overhead lights. The old carpet, damp from the constant rain seeping in under the building's front entrance, looked undisturbed. No footprints, no movement. She hesitated, then unlocked the door and cracked it open just an inch. The hallway smelled musty, laced with the scent of old water and something else, something faintly metallic. The air felt colder than it should. She stepped forward, glancing left, then right, still nothing. But just as she started to pull the door closed, her breath caught in her throat, a single, wet footprint. Right outside her door. She hadn't seen it before. Had it been there? It was impossible to tell in the dim light, but as she stared, something changed. The footprint was fading, the water seeping into the carpet, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. A sharp chill crawled up her spine, her fingers tightening around the doorknob. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking. She pressed her back against the wood, heart hammering. It was fine. There was nothing there. But when she turned, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The window across the room, the curtain was open. And outside, barely visible through the sheets of rain, the figure was standing right beneath her window, watching. Marla couldn't sleep. Not after that. The silence in her apartment was unbearable, the stillness pressing against her chest. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless patter of rain against the windows, a sound that now felt suffocating rather than soothing. Every tiny noise, the soft creak of the building, the groan of the pipes in the walls, felt like a warning, like something was creeping closer. She had to be imagining things. The knock, the footprint, the figure outside her window. It had to be her mind playing tricks on her. She hadn't slept properly in days. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the pressure of being alone in the middle of a storm, the isolation making her mind run wild. But when she finally closed her eyes, the images of the figure flashed behind her eyelids. A shadow standing in the rain, unmoving, watching. She jerked awake, gasping for breath, her heart pounding like a drum. The room felt colder now, the walls seeming to press in on her. The clock read 2:47 a.m. Her sheets were soaked with sweat. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and sat up, taking slow, deliberate breaths. She needed to calm down. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, checked the time again, and then scrolled through her messages, trying to focus on anything that wasn't the image of that figure outside her window. But her eyes kept flicking toward the curtains, the dark corner of the room, the way the rain danced against the glass, like it was moving with purpose. The room was too still, too quiet. She couldn't do it anymore. She needed to check again. She needed to see if it was still out there. Slowly, she got up and made her way to the window, the floor cold beneath her bare feet. She hesitated before drawing the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The rain blurred her vision, making the world outside seem like a dream, the shadows mixing with the sheets of water. But through the mist, she saw it. The figure. It wasn't across the street anymore. It was standing at the edge of her yard, closer than it had been before. Its shape was more distinct now, its posture unnervingly stiff, as if it had been standing there for hours. The rain clung to its form, but its features remained obscured, as if hidden beneath a dark, shifting veil. It was taller than she had first thought, impossibly tall, and its presence filled the space between the streetlight and her apartment. Marla's breath hitched in her chest. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. Then, as if sensing her gaze, it slowly turned its head toward her window. She yanked the curtain shut, heart racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. She staggered backward, pressing her back against the wall. The figure's eyes. She hadn't seen its eyes, but she could feel them, like two dark points of pressure drilling into her soul. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her frozen state. She grabbed it with trembling hands and saw a text from an unknown number. "I'm closer than you think." The room felt too small, the air too thick. The pressure was building again, the same weight that had settled in her chest the night before. She looked at the door, half expecting to hear that knock again, but it didn't come. Instead, she heard something worse, the sound of scratching, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the other side of the wall. The scratching continued, a slow, methodical sound, like something dragging itself across the plaster. Marla stood frozen in place, her eyes wide, her hands shaking as she held her phone. The screen was dim now, the text from the unknown number still glowing back at her like a taunt. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of the noise, but all she could hear was the gnawing, scraping sound on the other side of the wall. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to get out. She had to leave this apartment before whatever was out there, whatever was inside, found her. But when she stepped toward the door, her legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the floor. The weight of the air pressed on her chest, suffocating. She forced herself to breathe, to move. But the scratching didn't stop. It was getting louder, closer. Was it inside the wall? Was it moving toward her? Her fingers closed around the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made her freeze. Someone was walking toward her door, heavy, deliberate steps that made the floorboards creak under the weight. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of her door. Marla's breath caught in her throat, her back pressed to the cold wood. Knock. It was soft, but unmistakable. A slow, measured tap, just like before, but this time there was no hesitation. There was no fading, no silence, just the unyielding pressure of something outside, waiting, watching. She stepped back from the door, holding her breath, not daring to make a sound. She couldn't move. Her legs were numb. The seconds stretched into eternity, the ticking of the clock on the wall growing unbearably loud in the silence. It felt as if the room was shrinking, the walls closing in on her. The scratching had stopped. The footsteps were gone. The only sound left was the rain against the window, falling steadily, almost rhythmically. Then came a knock on her window. Marla's heart nearly stopped. It was faint, but there, right against the glass, like a finger tapping softly. She dared not look, but something inside her screamed that she had to. She was about to turn when the doorbell rang. A harsh, shrill sound that seemed out of place in the thick, damp air. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Without thinking, she rushed toward the door, her hand shaking as she grabbed the handle. But just before she could twist it open, she heard another voice, one that wasn't hers, calling from behind her. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Marla." The voice was soft, like a whisper, but it was unmistakably hers. And it came from the other side of the room. Marla turned slowly, but the room was empty. A chill ran down her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. The air felt cold, unnaturally cold. She backed up until her legs hit the edge of the couch, her mind racing. She needed to get out. She needed to leave now. Before she could make another move, a knock came again, this time at the door. Only this time it was a voice that was muffled, distorted, and yet strangely familiar. "Open the door, Marla. It's safe." "Now." It was Mrs. Kearns, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She'd seen Marla earlier that day, their brief exchange, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, the voice was wrong. There was something wrong with it. Marla's heart pounded. Something in the back of her mind told her that Mrs. Kearns knew something about this place, about the curse that seemed to be bleeding through the walls. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed Mrs. Kearns' number, praying that the voice on the other side of the door was a trick. It rang 3 times before Mrs. Kearns' shaky voice answered. "Marla." "Yes. Yes, it's me. What's going on? Please help me. I heard..." The line went dead. Marla's breath caught as she stared at her phone screen frozen in place. And then, before she could react, the knocking came again, this time louder, with a heavy, unrelenting force. It wasn't just the door. It was everywhere, the walls, the windows, the floors. Marla backed away, slowly at first, then stumbling as the knocking grew louder, closer, faster. It was coming from inside the walls now, and then she heard it. Mrs. Kearns' voice, clear and chilling, ringing through the apartment. "You should have listened, child." It was coming from the walls. Marla's hands shook violently as she stood in the center of her living room. surrounded by the sound of knocking and the strange, distorted voice of Mrs. Kearns. The walls seemed to hum with the force of the knocks, vibrating under the pressure. Her heart hammered in her chest, every beat like a drum in her ears, drowning out everything else. The apartment was no longer just a place of shelter, it had become a tomb. Each corner of the room felt colder than the last, as though the walls themselves were exhaling ice. The knocking from the walls stopped suddenly, and for a moment an unsettling silence settled over her, hanging thick in the air. But the silence was worse than the noise. Marla took a few shaky steps back, her feet brushing against the soaked carpet. The dampness had spread across the floor, leaving puddles where none had been before. It hadn't rained inside, but the carpet was wet, as if the room itself was slowly sinking into something deeper. The once familiar scent of the apartment, the faint smell of old books and stale air, was replaced by something foul, something metallic. She reached for the light switch, but before her hand could touch the cold metal, the lights flickered. The apartment plunged into darkness. Marla gasped, stumbling backward, her pulse quickening. The darkness felt alive, like it was reaching for her, pulling her into some other, unknown place. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight, but the beam of light wavered, flickering as if it too were unsure of what to reveal. There, in the pale circle of light, she saw it. The floor beneath her feet, where there had been nothing. But carpet moments ago was now covered in a thick, viscous liquid, dark, swirling like something alive. It spread outward, slowly, as if creeping toward her, reaching for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the liquid, trying to make sense of it. It was too dark to see the true color, but the glimmer of it in the dim light was enough to send a shiver down her spine. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, and Marla's stomach turned. It was water. But it wasn't just any water. She dropped to her knees, unable to look away as the liquid rippled, shifting and undulating as if something beneath the surface was moving. Slowly, it began to spread faster, the liquid flowing across the floor, with an unnatural ease as if it were part of the apartment itself. Her heart raced, panic bubbling up in her chest. She scrambled backward, her hands shaking as she tried to push herself away from the growing pool. But the liquid wasn't the only thing that was moving. As the pool of water spread, Marla heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible at first, but growing louder by the second. It was the sound of something scratching beneath the surface. Something was in the water. Something was alive. Marla's breath caught as she glanced toward the window. The rain was still falling in a steady stream, but the reflection in the glass showed her something that shouldn't have been there. The figure. The same figure from the night before. It stood outside the window again, just beyond the glass, watching her. Its shape was distorted by the heavy rain, its features still hidden beneath the dark veil. But Marla could feel its presence pressing against the glass. Like a heavy weight, she wanted to scream, to shout for help, but she knew no one could hear her. No one could see what she was seeing. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't on the door. It came from inside the walls. The walls thumped violently, as though something was trying to break through, trying to claw its way into the apartment. The sound was deafening, and Marla's body went rigid, her hands pressed tightly to her ears as if she could block it out. The water continued to spread across the floor, creeping toward her while the knocking from the walls became frantic, desperate. She couldn't stay in this apartment. She knew it. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone again, dialing Mrs. Kearns' number for the second time that night. But this time, when the call connected, there was no greeting. There was only static, and then a voice. Faint, warped, and distorted, as if coming from the bottom of a deep well. You don't understand. The curse, the rain, you can't escape. The line went dead. Marla's stomach twisted as the voice faded into the static, leaving only the echo of it in her ears. The water was nearly at her feet now, spreading faster than she could retreat. She stood, stumbling as the liquid slicked the floor beneath her. Her eyes darted around the room in panic, looking for an escape, but the apartment felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against her as the water rose higher, and then the whisper came. "It's not the rain, Marla." Marla spun around her, flashlight beam falling on the source of the voice. She saw the reflection of a figure standing just behind her, an outline barely visible in the darkened room. The figure was her own reflection, but it wasn't. The face staring back at her in the reflection was wrong. It was pale, too pale, with sunken eyes that were too large for the face. Its features were distorted, as though stretched and melted by time, like a broken mirror. And then in the water at her feet, she saw it. The reflection of the figure outside the window, staring in, its eyes now visible. The rain was no longer the only thing falling. The water in the apartment was thickening, darkening, and something was rising from it. Marla stumbled back, but the figure inside the water moved faster than she could. She felt its presence closing in, suffocating her, as if the apartment itself was becoming part of the storm. The liquid crept up her legs, cool and clammy, as if it were trying to pull her down, drag her under. It wasn't the rain. It was the water. The water was alive, and it was coming for her. Knock. The door. It came again, softer now, more insistent. The sound had changed, as if someone was trying to force their way in. She could hear it behind her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the water, from the reflections, from the figure standing at the window, closer now than it had ever been before. There was nowhere left to run. The walls were closing in, the water was rising, the figure outside was watching, and all Marla could hear now, above everything else, was the whisper, "You're already here." Marla's mind was splintering, each jagged thought cutting deeper than the last. The water had risen to her ankles, its cold fingers creeping upward, wrapping around her like a vice. Every time she thought she could breathe, the sensation of being pulled under, of being swallowed whole, surged again. The figure outside the window loomed closer, a black silhouette shifting in the storm. Her heart pounded in her chest faster than the water rising around her. But it was the knock that broke through the haze of panic, the slow, deliberate sound, just as it had been the night before. Knock, knock, knock. Her body trembled, frozen, in place. She couldn't look at the door again. She couldn't let herself face it, not when the walls were closing in. Not when the figure outside was getting so much closer, its outline so distinct now, the veil of rain thinning, revealing more. But she couldn't stay here either. The water was rising too fast, swallowing the room, and she could feel it seeping into her skin, turning everything cold and numb. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the sound of the knock for a moment. For a split second, Marla considered running. Running into the night, into the storm, away from the apartment, from the water, from whatever had been watching her. But where would she go? How could she escape when the very air seemed to conspire against her? The rain outside, the incessant knocking, the oppressive weight of the apartment. It was all too much. The walls, the floors, the windows, all of it felt like it was pulling her back, forcing her to stay. The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. Her knees buckled as the floor beneath her began to tremble. It was subtle at first, the vibrations, barely noticeable, but then they grew, deep, resonating through the room like the thrum of a heartbeat. The knock wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the walls. The walls themselves were knocking as though someone or something was trapped inside, desperate to get out. The scratching from earlier had returned, but now it was louder, more frantic. The floorboards creaked underfoot, as if they were being pushed up from beneath. A soft moan filled the room, a low guttural sound that seemed to crawl through the air and settle into Marla's bones. She staggered back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had to get out. She had to get away before whatever was in the walls, before whatever was pulling at her legs reached her. But every time she tried to move, she felt the walls closing in around her, like the apartment itself was tightening its grip on her, holding her in place. The water lapped at her calves now, cold and slick, the sound of it swirling around her, making her stomach churn. Knock, knock, knock. The knock was louder now, more insistent, rattling the door with a force that made the whole apartment shake. It wasn't a polite knock anymore. It was a demand, a desperate plea. Marla's pulse quickened. She couldn't take it. She couldn't stay here anymore, not with the walls shaking and the water rising, with the figure outside watching her through the window. She had to do something. She had to stop the knocking. But as she turned to face the door, the reflection in the window caught her eye. It was no longer just a vague shape in the rain. No, this time she could see it clearly, its features sharp and unnaturally defined. The figure outside was no longer just standing there, it was moving. Slowly, methodically, it was walking toward her window, its limbs jerking with an unsettling stiffness, like it was trying to mimic the motions of a human, but failing miserably. Its body was hunched, its face still obscured beneath the dark veil, but Marla could see its eyes now, faintly glowing beneath the heavy shadow. They were empty, hollow, black as night. Her heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively took a step back. The figure was moving closer, every step deliberate, like it knew she was watching, like it knew she could feel its presence pressing against the glass. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the cold window pane. Her fingers barely brushed against the glass when a sharp, unearthly shriek pierced the air, so loud and jarring that it made her flinch, her hands flying to her ears. The water around her sloshed violently as though something in it was struggling to break free. The knocking intensified, now a furious, continuous barrage, filling the apartment with a force that rattled her teeth. "Let me in." The voice came through the wall, clear and unnerving, though it sounded like it was coming from all directions at once. It wasn't Mrs. Kern's voice anymore. It wasn't even human. The words dragged themselves across her mind, like nails, scratching against glass. "Let me in." She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the room. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the knocking was coming from deep inside them, from the very heart of the building itself. The room felt like it was breathing, shifting, expanding. And then suddenly, the room grew darker. The light from the flashlight seemed to flicker, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Her breath hitched as she realized the shadows weren't just shifting, they were changing, morphing into shapes that resembled human forms, twisted and broken. Her mind reeled. She was suffocating in the space between these walls, trapped in the very thing that was trying to tear her apart. And yet, the knocking persisted. Her legs moved before her brain could process what was happening. She ran for the door, trying to get to the hallway, to escape the apartment, to get to freedom. Her hand shot out, grabbing the handle. But before she could twist it, the door slammed back into the frame, as if something was on the other side, holding it shut. "No." The voice was unmistakable now. "You cannot leave." Her mind screamed in protest, but her body froze. Her hand was still gripping the doorknob, and the room behind her felt alive, pulsing with an energy she couldn't understand. The figure outside had stopped at the window, standing perfectly still, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. Marla's breath caught as she took one last look at the dark silhouette beyond the glass. And then, without warning, the knocking came again, louder, stronger. It was coming from inside her head now. "Let me in." The door shook violently, the walls trembled, and the water rose higher, spilling over the floor and onto the walls. Something was moving within the liquid. Something was coming for her. Marla turned around, her body too stiff to react, and stared at the reflection of herself in the window. The figure outside had stepped closer, its face now barely inches from the glass, and then it smiled. Marla's vision blurred, her head spinning as the figure outside her window took another deliberate step forward, its face now fully visible through the glass. The smile, it was not a human smile. There were no lips, no warmth to it. It was an empty, gaping mockery of a grin, as though something had tried to force a semblance of human emotion, but had failed spectacularly. The skin of the figure's face hung loosely, as though it had been stretched and pulled in unnatural directions, its eyes wide and black, reflecting nothing but void. It wasn't just staring at her anymore, it was reaching for her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stepped back, her feet sinking deeper into the rising water. The cold, wet sensation made her stomach lurch. She could feel it, something pulling her toward the window, as if gravity itself had begun to bend, making her closer to the glass with every passing second. The water was no longer just a flood. It was a weight, a presence, trying to drag her into the dark. The knocking resumed, louder now, echoing from all directions. It came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and even from deep within her own mind, reverberating like a sound trapped in her skull. It was a sound that gnawed at her sanity, chewing its way into every thought she had. The figure outside continued to move closer, each step a slow, deliberate pace, as though savoring the terror it was inflicting. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to the present, the sudden interruption cutting through the fog of dread that had settled over her. She grabbed it, her hands slick with cold sweat, and saw a new message, this time from an unknown number. "They can't see you yet." Her heart skipped a beat, her fingers trembling as she typed a response, desperate for any explanation, any answer. "Who are you?" The phone buzzed again, almost immediately. "I know what's happening, but you don't. You need to listen." Marla stared at the message, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The figure outside was now pressing its face against the glass, its grin widening impossibly, its eyes never leaving hers. It was so close now, she could almost feel the coldness emanating from the glass. The water had reached her knees, and the reflection in the window was no longer just the figure. It was her own face, but twisted, as though the water itself had pulled her reflection into something far darker. Her phone buzzed again, a new message flashing on the screen. "Don't look away. Don't ever look away." A chill ran through Marla as she turned her eyes back to the window. She had thought that the figure outside was the worst thing. But what she saw in the reflection of the glass was far worse. It wasn't just her face anymore. There were others. Behind her, figures, standing in the shadows, watching from the edges of her vision, people she didn't recognize. They had been there the whole time, lurking in the periphery, hiding just beneath the surface of the water. And now they were reaching for her. Her body froze in terror. She could feel their presence, feel their eyes on her, as though they had been waiting for her to notice them. The reflection shifted again and the figures grew clearer, their forms distorted by the rain outside, but their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, were unmistakable. They were staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The knocking came again, louder now, the force behind it shaking the apartment. The walls trembled violently as the knocking grew faster, as if whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. Marla felt a pull toward the door, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the reflection. Every time she blinked, the figures behind her grew closer, their hands reaching out, pulling themselves towards her, but always just out of reach. Suddenly, the water at her feet surged forward, splashing as though something was moving under its surface. Marla's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as she realized that whatever was in the water, it was trying to reach her. She tried to move, but her feet were stuck, the water now at her waist, crawling higher, cold and oppressive. Her legs were heavy, weighed down by the liquid as though it was trying to keep her in place. The reflection in the window shifted again, and she saw it. The faces, the ones behind her. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming for her. One by one, they pushed their way forward from the shadows, their hands reaching toward her, their eyes wide with hunger. The knocking grew more violent, the sound shuddering through the walls, and the figures outside the window moved. They were no longer standing still. They were pressing against the glass, their hands and faces distorted as they shoved against it, trying to break through. Their faces were a blur of jagged edges, their expressions warped and grotesque, their eyes so wide that they seemed to be swallowing the light. Marla screamed, her throat raw, but the sound was swallowed by the room, by the water, by the knocking. There was no escaping it. The walls were closing in. The figures outside the window were pressing harder, trying to force their way through the glass, their breath fogging up the panes. The water around her was rising faster now, seeping into the walls, flooding the room with cold, black liquid. She could feel it creeping toward her chest, her arms, suffocating her as it rushed to swallow her whole. Her phone buzzed again, the screen glowing in the dark, but Marla could barely bring herself to look at it. She was trapped. Trapped in the apartment. Trapped in the water. Trapped with the figures that were now inside the reflection, inside her mind. She reached for the phone, desperate to understand, to make sense of anything that was happening. You're too late. They're already inside. The knocking reached a deafening crescendo, and with a final, terrible force, the door shattered. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, and the water surged upward, swallowing everything in its path. The shadows, the figures, and the reflection. They were all merging, blending into one horrible mass of shapes and whispers and cold, biting water. Marla's vision blurred, the light from her phone dimming as the water reached her neck, and, as her world collapsed into darkness, she heard it again. You can't escape. And then, the last knock, the final one, came from inside her head. Marla's mind splintered into fragments as the darkness swallowed her. There was no air, no sound, only the cold, suffocating weight of the water pressing in around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her limbs felt heavy, her body sluggish, as if the liquid had seeped into her bones. Her lungs burned as she fought for breath, but there was no escape. It felt as though she were drowning, sinking into a place that was not part of the world she had known. It was a place beyond understanding, a place where time and space twisted and blurred. The water around her seemed to shift, becoming colder, darker, and more oppressive with each passing moment. She could feel it creeping up her neck, invading her thoughts, seeping into the very fabric of her being. But through the fog of fear and panic, one thought broke through the chaos. The figure. The Rain Watcher. It had been there from the beginning, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to notice, waiting for her to succumb. She had to remember. She had to understand. The world around her shifted, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the water seemed to recede. Her breath caught as her feet touched solid ground once more, and she stumbled forward, gasping for air. She was no longer in the apartment, no longer in the suffocating water, but instead, she found herself standing in the middle of a dimly lit room. The walls were warped, cracked, as if the very building was decaying from the inside. The floor beneath her was slick, with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of rot. She was back in the heart of the nightmare. The walls around her seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and for the first time, She noticed the marks carved into them, scratches, deep and jagged, as though something had been trying to claw its way through. Her fingers brushed the walls, and the chill that ran through her body was unlike anything she had felt before. It was as if the room was alive, watching her, waiting for her to remember. There, at the center of the room, was an old weathered journal. It was open, pages yellowed with age, the ink faded and smudged, as if the words had been written in a hurry, as though the writer had known time was running out. She approached it slowly, her trembling hands reaching out to turn the pages. The first page was filled with hasty scrawl, the handwriting uneven and frantic. "It is not the rain that kills you, it is the watcher, the one who waits in the dark." Marla's fingers froze on the page, her pulse quickening. The words felt like a message meant for her, something she needed to understand. The ink was still damp, as though it had been written recently. Her mind raced, piecing the fragments of the past together. The figure outside her window, the constant rain, the relentless knocking. She could feel it now, the truth creeping into the edges of her thoughts. The rain watcher was not a mere phantom, a shadow that existed only in her imagination. It was something far older, something tied to the very land, to the town itself. The journal spoke of a curse that had been passed down through generations, one that seemed to affect the town every few decades. It described the Watcher as an entity that could never be seen fully, always just out of reach, always present, but never understood. "It comes when the rain falls hardest," the journal read, "when the storm lasts too long. It comes for those who are alone, for those who have forgotten. It feeds on your fear, your doubt. It waits, always watching, waiting." Marla's stomach twisted as she read the words. Her mind was still struggling to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. The figure outside her window, the knock that had driven her mad. It was all part of this. The curse. The Rain Watcher was not just a creature. It was a force, a malevolent presence that had been tied to this town long before she had ever arrived. She turned the page, her hands trembling. The next entry was more coherent, as though the writer had been trying to explain something. But the words were filled with panic, the ink splattered in places as if written in haste. "The Watcher is always hungry. It needs something to take, and when the storm has raged long enough, it will come for you. It will take your soul, your mind, and bind it to the rain. Your face will become one with the mist. Your voice will be lost in the wind. You will be a part of it forever." Marla's throat tightened as she read those words. The images in her mind shifted, becoming clearer. The figures she had seen outside her window, the ones that had watched her from the shadows. They were the souls of those who had come before her, taken by the Rain Watcher, bound to the storm, forever trapped in its grip. The knocking, the water, the figure, all of it was connected. She turned another page. The next few entries were barely readable, the handwriting becoming more erratic, the sentences fragmented. The last entry, however, was legible, though it was written in a desperate hand, as though the writer had known their time was running out. "I tried to stop it. I tried to break the cycle, but the Watcher is too powerful. It is not just a thing. It is a part of the storm itself, a manifestation of the rain, of the land. It cannot be defeated. It will come for you, and when it does, there will be no escape." Marla's heart pounded as she closed the journal, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She could hear the rain outside pounding against the windows, and she knew it was not just the storm that was coming for her. It was the Watcher, the very force that had been stalking the town for generations. She looked around the room, her eyes falling on the walls once more. The marks, the scratches, they weren't just random. They were symbols, markings left by those who had tried to escape. The Watcher had been here before, and it had taken others. But those who had resisted, those who had tried to run, they were the ones who had left these marks, desperate to hold onto their sanity as they were pulled into the storm. Marla's mind was reeling. She had to leave. She had to get out before the storm consumed her, before the Watcher took her too. But as she turned to leave, a shadow passed across the doorway, and she felt the temperature in the room drop. The door slammed shut, and the water began to rise again, faster than before. The knocking returned, louder, more insistent than ever. The walls trembled with the force of it, and Marla realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escaping this. She was trapped. The Watcher was here, and it was coming for her. Marla's breath was shallow, ragged, as she stood frozen in the room, the journal still clenched tightly in her hands. The temperature in the room had plummeted again, her skin prickling with the cold, the air thick with the unmistakable presence of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. The shadows around her seemed to twist and distort, stretching longer and darker, as if they were reaching toward her, hungry, waiting. The knocking had stopped for now, but the silence felt wrong, unnatural, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Her legs felt like lead, weighed down by more than just fear. The water was rising faster now, sloshing around her ankles, swirling with dark, murky tendrils that seemed to crawl toward her. It was as if the room itself was shifting, as though the apartment had become part of the nightmare. The walls, once solid and confining, now seemed to pulse with some malevolent force. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of old earth, of something forgotten and buried. It was no longer just an apartment. It was a tomb, a vessel for something far worse. As she glanced back toward the window, the figure outside was still there. But it had changed. No longer the indistinct shadow she had first seen, it was now fully formed, its shape terrifyingly clear. Its features were no longer just vague distortions in the rain. They were sharp, contorted, impossibly wrong. Its face was stretched wide, as though its skin had been pulled taut across its skull. The eyes, those empty black voids, seemed to bore into her very soul. It was smiling again, its lips curled back in a grotesque, mocking grin. And this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, there were others, figures standing motionless, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows caught in the wind. They were everywhere, pressing against the window, filling the periphery of her vision. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were the same as the ones she had seen in her reflection earlier. Hollow eyes, open mouths, twisted features. They were all watching her, waiting for something, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to give in. The knocking started again, softer at first, but growing in volume and intensity. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. The sound was deafening, as though the entire building was shaking under the weight of it. She could feel it in her bones, reverberating through her body, rattling her teeth. Her heart pounded. In her chest, each beat like a drum, drowning out everything else. She had to move. She had to get out. But every time she tried to move, her body refused. It was like the apartment had become a prison, the walls closing in on her, the very air suffocating her. The knocking was no longer a mere sound. It had become something physical, a force that tugged at her, pulling her toward the walls, as though the very fabric of the room was trying to consume her. Marla's mind raced, her thoughts spinning out of control. She had to find a way out. She had to escape before it was too late. The journal's words echoed in her mind, the warning from the one who had written it. The Watcher comes for those who are alone. But that was the problem. She wasn't just alone. She was trapped in this place, in this nightmare, with no way out. The storm outside was never ending, the rain pounding against the window like a threat. She was drowning, suffocating, caught between the walls of this place and the relentless pull of the Watcher. But there was something she hadn't noticed before. Something in the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. She hadn't seen it, not until now. A door. It had been there all along, tucked away in the farthest corner, almost as though it had been waiting for her to notice it. Her pulse quickened as she stepped toward it, her feet still sinking into the cold water that now covered the floor. Every step felt like wading through a nightmare, the water thick and oppressive, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down. The door seemed impossibly far away, its frame shrouded in darkness. But she had to reach it. She had to get to the door. She didn't know where it led, but it had to lead somewhere, anywhere, but here. The knocking grew louder, the sound nearly deafening now. Her entire body trembled as she reached for the door handle, her fingers slick with fear. As she touched it, the door shook, the wood vibrating beneath her fingers. It was as if the building itself had come alive, reacting to her touch, warning her not to open it. But she didn't care. She needed to get out. The door creaked open, slowly, as though it hadn't been used in years. A draft of cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of earth and rot, of something ancient and forgotten. Marla hesitated for only a second before stepping through. She was no longer in the apartment. She was in something else. The world around her had changed completely, gone were the cracked walls, the water-soaked floor, the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment. Now she stood in a long, dark corridor, its walls made of stone, old and weathered, as though it had been here for centuries. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth, of decay. The only light came from a faint flickering glow at the end of the hallway. It was distant, but it beckoned her, pulling her forward, urging her to move. But as she stepped forward, she heard it, the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was no one there. She was alone, or at least she thought she was. But then the whispers started. Faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder, more insistent, as if they were coming from all around her. You cannot escape. You are already ours. The words sent a cold chill down her spine, and she spun around again, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But there was still no one there. No one except for the dark hallway stretching out before her, and the flickering light at the end. The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent, until it felt like they were inside her head, filling every inch of her mind. She had to get to the light. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let the darkness catch her. But then she felt it. A presence behind her, something close, breathing heavily in the air, its cold breath brushing against her neck. You are already part of it. Marla turned and ran, her feet slipping on the stone floor as she sprinted toward the light at the end of the hall. But the closer she got, the more she felt it. The weight of the Watcher following her, closing in. The walls around her began to shift, closing in from both sides, as if the very corridor itself was trying to trap her, to squeeze the life out of her. The light flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, grasping, pulling her toward the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the end of the hallway, the light now blinding, swallowing her entire field of vision. She reached out, her hand trembling, and grabbed the light source, only to find that it wasn't light at all. It was a window. And beyond the window, She saw it. The town. Her town. But it was different. It was broken. Dead. The streets were empty. The buildings decayed and collapsed, consumed by the endless rain, and standing at the center of the town, bathed in the eternal storm, was the figure, the rain watcher. And this time, it wasn't watching. It was smiling, and it was coming, for her. The smile on the rain watcher's face was no longer just an expression of malice. It was a promise that she was already part of the storm, part of the curse, part of something far older than the town, older than her. The town outside. The window was no longer just a memory of a place she knew. It was a hollow shell, decayed and twisted, a reflection of the fate she would soon share. There was nothing left but ruin, and the watcher stood there in the midst of it all, its black eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart freeze in her chest. Marla's mind was screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. Her body felt paralyzed, locked in place by the weight of the watcher's gaze. The rain outside poured relentlessly, as it had for days, but it wasn't just rain. It was a veil that had consumed everything in its path. People, buildings, memories, and now it was coming for her. The whispers began again, crawling under her skin, vibrating through her bones. They were no longer distant or muffled. They were inside her head, thrumming through her thoughts, wrapping around her consciousness like a vine, twisting tighter with every passing second. You belong to it now. You belong to us. The words were a chant, repetitive and hollow. She wanted to cover her ears, but the voice wasn't external anymore. It wasn't something she could block out. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from her own mind, and it was growing louder. Marla's hand trembled as it pressed against the cold window pane. She couldn't look away from the watcher. She had to know. She had to understand. The dark figure outside moved, its body a grotesque puppet, jerking unnaturally as it took one slow step toward her. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, to breathe, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something behind the watcher, a reflection. But it wasn't hers. It was a woman's face, a pale, distorted face, hollow-eyed and twisted, staring at her with a silent scream. She saw it so clearly that for a moment her breath caught in her throat. But as soon as the figure behind the watcher had come into focus, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the creeping whispers behind. It has been waiting for you. The walls began to tremble, and the sound was no longer just a distant vibration. It was a rumble, a deep, hollow sound that shook the entire building, reverberating through the floor, through the walls, through her very body. Marla stumbled backward, but the room felt smaller now, closing in around her as the dark, swirling waters rose faster, drowning her once more. The storm had reached its peak, and the watcher had reached its threshold. She was running out of time. Cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of the earth, of the rain, of something old and rotting. She could feel the room breathing, the walls shifting and groaning as if something ancient, something far more powerful than she could comprehend, was moving beneath the surface of the building itself. The walls creaked, bending inward, as though they were being reshaped by some unseen force. It was as if the very apartment was part of the curse, part of the watcher's domain. Marla's pulse raced, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she could hear it over the sound of the storm. The floor beneath her feet began to give way, cracks spiderwebbing across the hardwood, and the water continued to rise, higher and higher, a relentless tide threatening to swallow her whole. The figure outside the window grew closer, its distorted limbs jerking with sickening motions. It was too close now, its face filling the glass. The smile on its lips was wider than ever, impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a grotesque mockery of a human expression. Its hollow eyes never left hers, and she could feel its presence inside her, worming its way into her thoughts. The voice in her head became clearer. "You have a choice." The words echoed through her mind, and for a moment she thought she might lose herself entirely to the madness. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like an animal, pulling at the window, rattling the glass. The world outside was consumed by the rain, an endless, suffocating downpour that blurred the edges of reality. The watcher's face was pressed against the glass, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, its smile widening as if it were savoring the moment. "You have a choice," the voice repeated. "You can remain here with us and become part of the storm, or you can give us someone else." The words were a dark promise. They weren't a question. They were an ultimatum. Marla's hands shook as they reached toward the window, pressing against the cold glass. The watcher's smile never faltered, and the whispers grew louder, closer. She could feel the pressure building, the storm closing in on her, both outside and inside her own mind. It was as if the very fabric of her existence was being unraveled piece by piece. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, trying to hold onto some shred of reason. The curse, the storm, the watcher. It was all too much to understand. But the choice was clear now. She could either remain in this place, trapped in the storm, her body and soul consumed by it, or the thought twisted in her mind like a knife, or she could pass it on. She could give it to someone else, to someone who didn't know, someone who wasn't prepared for the horror that was waiting. The water was up to her waist now, the room drowning in darkness, the knocking coming from the walls louder than ever. The figure outside the window loomed over her, its smile still widening, still waiting. She could feel its cold breath against the glass, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. And then she realized she wasn't alone. The faces in the shadows, the ones she had seen behind her in the reflection, they weren't gone. They were here, in the water, in the walls, in the very air she breathed. They were the souls of those who had made the same choice before her, those who had given the curse away, who had sacrificed someone else. They were the ones who had failed to escape. The whispering voices were their voices. The figures she saw in the water, in the shadows, were the ones who had been claimed, bound to the Watcher's storm. Marla's heart pounded as she felt the pressure rise. She could feel the walls pushing in on her, the water pulling her down, the Watcher's presence closing in. The choice was before her, and then, just as she thought she might drown in the darkness, she understood. There was no escape, because the choice had already been made for her. The Watcher had always known. It had always been waiting for her, and now it was time to become the Watcher. The moment Marla understood, everything shifted. Time itself seemed to distort, stretching like an elastic band pulled too tight. The walls that had been pressing in on her now seemed to expand, growing distant in a way that felt unnatural, as though she was standing on the edge of reality itself. The water around her surged, rising at an alarming rate, its cold embrace now at her shoulders. But it no longer felt like she was drowning. No, it felt like she was being consumed, being pulled into something greater than herself. The Watcher outside her window pressed its face against the glass, its smile widening inhumanly. The glass fogged over, the condensation turning into strange patterns that writhed and twisted like living things. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urgent, frantic, as if something was coming to claim her. The storm outside raged harder, and she could hear the wind howling as though it were trying to break through the very walls of her apartment. but there was a hollow emptiness beneath that sound, as if the world itself were being erased, piece by piece. The choice was no longer hers. She felt it, the pull. Something otherworldly reaching for her, wrapping around her mind, dragging her toward that smile, toward the endless storm that waited just beyond the glass. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find something to hold on to, but the walls were now shifting, pulsing with an almost sentient energy. The water around her continued to rise, moving with purpose, not like a natural flood, but as if it were alive with intent. And then she heard it. The door. The door she hadn't noticed before. The door at the far end of the room, hidden, in shadow, unnoticed amidst the chaos. It was always there, wasn't it? How had she missed it? It wasn't just any door. It was a threshold, a passageway to somewhere else, somewhere beyond. The knocking from the walls had stopped. The whispers had quieted. It was as if the storm, the watcher, everything had grown still, waiting for her to make the final decision, but it wasn't her decision to make anymore. Without fully understanding why, Marla took a step toward the door. Her legs were heavy, her body numb, as though the water had seeped into her very bones. But still she moved one step after another toward the thing that had waited for her. The door beckoned her, and as she reached out to touch the cold, rusted handle, she felt an electric jolt pass through her body, a shock of cold that made her heart stutter. The door opened on its own. A deep, guttural noise rumbled from within, like something ancient and forgotten awakening. The door creaked on its hinges, but the sound was unnatural, like the groan of something alive, something hungering for her. Marla hesitated just for a moment, her mind fighting to process what was happening, but there was no time. The water was already at her chin, and the storm had intensified beyond reason. The only thing that was real now was the door. It was all that remained. She stepped through. Beyond the threshold, the world was not what she expected. The room she entered was nothing like the apartment she had just left. There was no water here, no storm, no oppressive weight pressing down on her. Instead, she found herself in a vast, cavernous space, endless and dark. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay, but there was something more here, something alive. The room stretched before her in all directions, a place that felt like it was outside of time. No walls, no floor, no ceiling, just an infinite expanse of darkness and cold. The only source of light came from a faint pulsing glow in the distance, barely visible through the thick fog that rolled and churned across the floor. The ground was uneven, rough stone, and it felt ancient, like it had been carved out of the very bones of the earth. And standing at the center of the room, bathed in that sickly, pulsing light, was the Watcher. It was no longer just an entity outside her window. It was here, in front of her, its presence filling the space, its massive form dwarfing her. The Watcher had no shape, no true form. Its body was a shifting mass of shadows, tendrils of dark energy that seemed to curl and unfurl like smoke. But it was solid and real in a way that made her stomach churn. It was watching her. The Watcher's face, if it could be called a face, was an impossibility. It was an amalgamation of hundreds, thousands of faces, each one stretched, distorted, overlapping in a grotesque, endless loop. Eyes within eyes, mouths that never stopped, whispering, silent screams carved into its features. It wasn't just watching her, it was seeing her, seeing into the deepest, darkest parts of her soul, knowing everything she was, everything she had ever been. And it was waiting. The Watcher spoke, but its voice wasn't something that could be heard with ears. It was felt, like a vibration deep within her chest, a hum that resonated with something primal, something older than language. The words weren't in her ears, they were in her mind, flooding her thoughts with a terrible certainty. You have come. Its voice was smooth and ancient, like the sound of the ocean crashing against an unyielding shore. It wasn't just a voice. It was a force, a command, an invitation, an inevitability. I've been waiting for you, for this moment. The room seemed to shift, to expand, as if the Watcher's presence was filling it with a terrible weight. The ground beneath Marla's feet seemed to pulse with the Watcher's energy, and for a brief moment she felt as though she were being pulled toward it, drawn by some invisible force. Her body trembled, her heart thundering in her chest. She didn't know if it was the Watcher, or the room, or the place that was doing it, but she felt like a puppet, her every move controlled by something beyond her. The Watcher didn't move, but she felt it coming closer. It was pressing in on her, its presence heavy, suffocating, and then its voice again, so clear in her mind, so absolute. You understand now. Marla's body went numb as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. It was too late. It had always been too late. The Watcher wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just a curse. It was time itself, a force that existed beyond the world she knew, beyond the town, beyond everything. It wasn't waiting for her to choose. It had already chosen. She was the next one to be taken. She had already crossed the threshold. Her breath hitched in her chest as she stumbled backward, her mind racing for a way out. But the Watcher's presence dominated the space. It was the space. There was no escape. The light before her flickered, dimming and brightening, casting long shadows across the floor. And as the shadows twisted and writhed, she saw them, the faces, the figures she had seen before. They were in the room with her now, moving in the darkness. Faces pressed up against the walls, faces pressed up against her soul, silently screaming. You are already part of it. You always have been. Her body froze, her legs stiffening beneath her as the truth flooded her mind. She understood now. She had always been part of it. The Watcher, the storm, the rain. It was all part of her fate, part of a cycle that had existed long before she had arrived in the town, long before she had ever known its curse. And now, there was no turning back. The storm cannot be outrun, the Watcher whispered, its voice vibrating through her very soul. The rain will come, and you will return to it. You will join us. The room collapsed inward, the walls twisting, the darkness consuming everything. And as the Watcher's grip tightened around her, Marla knew the storm had claimed her. There was no escape. The darkness around Marla seemed to close in on her, a suffocating, impenetrable void, and the walls of the room, if they could still be called walls, shifted and flickered like the shadows themselves were alive. Every step she took, every breath she drew, felt as though she were walking on the edge of some unfathomable abyss. It was no longer just the Watcher that held her gaze. It was the place itself, the storm, the very curse that had drawn her in. It was a force much older than her, much older than the town she had once lived in. She felt it now, deep in her bones, a gnawing certainty that this place wasn't just a part of the town. It was the town, the very land, the air, the soul of it. Everything she had ever known was warped, twisted, like a reflection of something far darker. The Watcher loomed before her, its vast, shifting mass of shadows barely contained in the empty space. She had once thought it was simply a figure, a creature, a thing from the dark. But now, as it towered over her, she understood. The Watcher was everything. It was the storm, the rain, the city's ancient history, its unspeakable curse. It was the shadow that had always been present, just out of reach, just below the surface, waiting for her to finally understand. Her legs felt like lead. The water, which had seemed to rise only moments before, now felt like an ocean, stretching out around her, suffocating her in its icy grip. Marla tried to scream, but the air was thick and heavy, as though it was being squeezed out of her lungs. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling as if it were a living creature. And above the storm, above the walls of this cavernous room, above the Watcher, was the rain. The rain was never just a part of the weather. It was the rain, the source, the origin of all this. The moment the water rose in her apartment, she had felt it. The moment the door had opened, she had stepped into it. The storm, the never-ending rain, a phenomenon tied to everything around her. The land, the town, the Watcher. The whispers began again. But this time they weren't just whispers. The words drummed in her head, a relentless pounding, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. She felt them in her veins, in her blood, spreading throughout her body like poison. They were a part of her now. You are the Watcher now. The words burrowed into her skull, and with them came a flood of memories, visions from long ago. She saw herself, not as she was now, but as something else, something older. She was standing on the edge of the town, her town, but it was different. The streets were dark, the houses rotting, the windows shattered. A storm raged overhead, its rain falling in torrents. And in the center of it all was her, standing motionless, just as she had seen the Watcher standing on the street, just as she had seen it watching her from the window. But this time, it was her face, her eyes. Her body had been twisted by time, her form stretched and contorted into something unrecognizable, something that had long since lost its humanity. And yet, in the depths of the storm, there she was, waiting. You were always meant to be here. The voice was cold and hollow, an echo of what she had become. You were always meant to be part of it. The storm chooses, and now it has chosen you. Marla gasped, her chest heaving as if she had been drowning for centuries. The memory faded, but the truth lingered. It was her. The Watcher had been her. It had always been her. There was no escaping it. There was no way out. She was a vessel, just like all those who had come before her, all those who had been taken by the Watcher and bound to the storm. They had been chosen. And now, she was the latest in a long line of victims. Her body convulsed as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She was the one the Watcher had been waiting for. She was the next to become the Watcher. The storm could not be outrun, could not be stopped. It had existed long before her, and it would continue long after. It was the eternal cycle, and now she was part of it. Her hands trembled as she reached out, feeling for something, anything to hold on to. The darkness stretched before her, the walls of the room pulsating with the rhythm of the rain. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, as though they were pulling her toward the center of the room, toward the Watcher. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to be part of it, but it was too late. The choice had been made long ago. The Watcher's grin stretched impossibly wide. It reached out toward her with limbs that twisted unnaturally, like broken branches snapping in the wind. The edges of its form rippled, its shadowy mass shifting and flowing like ink in water. It wasn't just reaching for her. It was merging with her, consuming her. Her body no longer felt like her own. It felt wrong, as if her limbs were no longer hers to control. The sensation was overwhelming, like drowning in a sea of darkness. Each breath she took pulling her deeper into the void. Her skin seemed to crawl, her body writhing as if something was inside her trying to break free, let go. The Watcher's voice echoed in her mind, and she could feel the presence of those who had gone before her, trapped in the storm, bound to the rain. She felt their faces, their eyes, their suffering. She felt them all, 1,000 souls calling, to her, urging her to give in. There was a moment, a fleeting moment, where Marla thought she might still escape. She thought she might break free from the suffocating darkness, the overwhelming pull of the Watcher. But she knew deep down that there was no escape. There had never been an escape. The storm was inevitable. The rain would always fall. And now Marla understood. She wasn't just a part of the storm. She was the storm. Her body collapsed to the ground, no longer in control. Her limbs, now stiff and unnatural, reached up toward the Watcher. And as she felt the final pull, as she felt herself dissolve into the shadows, the room fell silent. The whispers faded, and the rain outside ceased to exist. There was nothing left. Only the Watcher. Only the storm. The darkness wrapped itself around Marla like a suffocating shroud, and the moment her mind seemed to break, the world shifted once more. No longer was she in that cavernous, endless room surrounded by the oppressive presence of the Watcher. The storm had stopped, and in its place was an eerie, unnatural stillness. It felt as though she had been suspended in time, floating between realms. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like wet earth and forgotten dreams. But as the dark veil receded, she felt the pull of something familiar, a tug in the depths of her consciousness, like the faint memory of a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She opened her eyes, if she had eyes at all, and saw, or rather, felt the world around her. She could no longer distinguish between what was her own form and what had become of her. She felt like nothing and everything at once, existing in a place where time was neither a straight line nor a circle, but a broken fragment suspended in infinite stillness. Then, the voices came. They were faint at first, barely discernible, like whispers on the wind. But as they grew clearer, the weight of them pressed in on her, dozens, hundreds, until they surrounded her completely. Each voice sounded distant, as though it were floating just out of reach, coming from all sides, overlapping each other in a cacophony of broken murmurs. They were not speaking to her, not directly, but they were speaking about her. She's one of us now, a voice whispered, one of the forgotten ones. Marla's mind, if it could still be called her mind, seethed with confusion. She wasn't dead, not yet. She couldn't be. She was still here, still trapped in this place, in this void, where the walls of reality had melted away. Yet the whispers spoke of her as though she were lost, erased, a fragment of the past that had been ripped away. And somehow she understood. She will remember, though. They always do. A chilling laugh echoed in the vast emptiness. It was a low, guttural sound full of centuries of torment. The laughter reverberated in her bones, and for a brief moment she was thrust into a series of horrific flashes, a kaleidoscope of faces broken and stretched beyond recognition, their eyes wide with terror. They were all standing in the same dark, cold place, just like her, waiting. She had seen these faces before, the figures that had pressed against the window, the ones with distorted eyes and twisted features. The ones trapped in the reflection, they were here. But now they weren't just silhouettes in the shadows. They were real, and they were staring at her, or through her, their hollow gazes carrying the weight of their own pain. She recognized them now, not by their faces, but by the echo of their voices in her mind. They had been here, just as she had. They were the forgotten ones, the ones who had failed to escape, the ones who had been taken by the Watcher before her. The ones who had become part of the storm, bound forever to the endless rain and the dark, writhing entity that controlled it all. And now they were whispering her name. Her body, or what was left of it, quivered, the sensation of their eyes, upon her pushing her to the brink of madness. She had been pulled in. She had become a part of it. But there was something else, something terrible. Marla felt her awareness slip away again, like water through her fingers. The Watcher was still There, watching, its presence looming behind the veil of this strange, infinite place. It had always been there. It had always been watching, waiting not for her to choose, but for her to finally accept what she had become. Her mind reeled. No, she thought, I'm not one of them. I don't belong here. But in the darkness, the Watcher's voice pierced through. Her thoughts, the words vibrating like an iron bell deep inside her chest. You always have. And in that moment, she knew. The Watcher wasn't just waiting to take her. It had never stopped taking her. She had always been part of this place, part of the cycle. The Watcher had been inside her before she even stepped into that cursed town. It had been in her from the moment she entered, drawn by the storm, by the curse, the water, the rain, the suffocating darkness. It had been in her all along. The Watcher wasn't a being separate from her. It had been inside her, feeding off. Her fear feeding off her desperation. It was a part of her just as much as she was a part of it. She had never been free. She had only been waiting. The voices, now more distinct, took on a different tone, urgent, desperate. You must accept it. You must become it. Their words swirled around her, clawing at her mind, and just as she thought she might lose herself entirely, she felt it, an overwhelming pull, a gravity that came from the center of it all. The Watcher was calling to her, urging her forward. It wanted her, it needed her, and for the first time, Marla understood. She wasn't meant to escape. She wasn't meant to run. There was only one thing left for her to do. The storm had always been waiting for her. Embrace it, the voices whispered. Become one with the rain. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the center of the darkness, toward the flickering, pulsating glow in the distance. And as she approached, the faces around her, those who had been claimed before her, stepped aside. They didn't look at her. They didn't speak to her. They watched. They always watched. She was no longer running. She was no longer trying to escape. She was becoming the Watcher. Marla reached out, her fingers brushing against the pulsating glow. It wasn't a light. It was the storm. It was the heart of it. She felt it pull her in, closer and closer, until there was nothing left but the storm's infinite pull, the weight of it bearing down on her. And as the glow consumed her, as the rain surrounded her, she understood what had happened. She had become the Watcher. She was now the one who waited in the shadows, the one who stood at the edge of the storm, watching, always watching. And her face would be the next to press against the window, for she was now part of the storm, and the storm would never end. Marla's body felt weightless, as though she were floating in some boundless void, suspended between worlds. The storm, the Watcher, it all swallowed her. She could no longer distinguish where she ended, and the darkness began. The faces around her, the forgotten souls of those who had come before her, seemed to drift in and out of her vision, like lost memories at the edge of her consciousness. Their presence was both haunting and comforting, an inescapable reminder of the fate she had now become, but it wasn't over. It could never be over. The storm had no end, no clear beginning. It was a cycle, an endless loop of waiting, of watching, of torment. And now, Marla understood. She had always been part of it, always bound to it in ways she hadn't known. The Watcher, the endless rain, the incessant knocking. Everything had been a part of her since the moment she entered the town, since the moment she had felt the pull of the storm. It wasn't just the town that was cursed. It was everything. The land, the sky, the people who lived in it. The curse had stretched its roots deep into the earth, feeding off the fear, the isolation, the longing of those who had wandered too close. Marla felt the weight of the curse press down on her, as if it were a living thing, breathing alongside her. She could hear the whispers again, the familiar voices of those who had been claimed before her. Their words were like a dark lullaby, and though they no longer spoke to her directly, she could hear their voices in the distance, mingling with her own thoughts, drawing her deeper into the storm. "You are the Watcher now." The words echoed through her mind, louder than any thunder. They were no longer a command. They were a truth carved into her very essence. There was no turning back, no way to escape. The Watcher's presence was suffocating, but it was also familiar, like an old friend. Its cold, dark embrace wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the infinite, stretching her perception beyond the boundaries of time and space. Her soul, if it could still be called a soul, had become a part of it, a part of the eternal rain. She was a part of the curse, woven into the fabric of this place, this cycle. And as she moved, she felt the pull of the town, distant but always present, calling to her from the fog, from the darkness. She knew now that she was not just a spectator. She was not merely a part of the Watcher. She was one of them, the forgotten, the ones who had been consumed, their identities lost to the storm. The faces that had surrounded her, those who had once been like her, living, breathing, full of life, were now part of the rain, part of the endless cycle of torment. They had been pulled in, just as she had been, long ago. They had wandered too close to the storm and had never returned. Marla reached out, but there was nothing left to touch. There was only the void, only the storm. She could feel the presence of the Watcher just behind her, as it had always been. But there was something else now, something more than just the Watcher, something that waited in the darkness, something ancient and unknowable. It was the source of the storm, the heart of the curse, and it whispered to her now, just as it had whispered to the others before her. "Come." The word was simple, yet it resonated deep within her, reverberating through every fiber of her being. The command was clear: come forward, join the cycle. The storm was always waiting, always hungry, always ready to consume those who wandered. Too close, and Marla knew now that there was no resistance, no way to fight it. The storm would take what it wanted, and the cycle would begin anew. She had been chosen. She had been marked. She had become part of the Watcher. And when the storm called, there was no escaping it. As she stepped forward, her form, her essence, moved as though in slow motion, her limbs moving without her consent. She had no will of her own anymore. The storm had claimed her. She was part of it. She was one with the Watcher. She felt herself drift toward the center of the storm, where the faces of those who had come before her pressed against the edges of her mind, their silent screams echoing in the void. She was not the first to be claimed. She would not be the last. This was the fate of everyone who came too close to the storm, to the Watcher. They would all become part of it. But as she reached the center of the storm, a strange thing happened. The whispers faded. The oppressive weight of the Watcher lifted, if only for a moment. And in that moment, she could feel something else, a presence, a voice, familiar and human. Marla. Her heart stopped. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was a name she had known, a voice she had heard long ago. It was her name, her real name, the one she had left behind in the town, the one she had forgotten in the midst of the storm. She wanted to call out, but the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind the fog of the storm. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. But the voice was still there, still calling to her. "Marla, please." The voice was clearer now, more desperate. It was her voice, the voice of the person she used to be, the person who had once walked freely, unbound by the storm. It was as though the person she had been was trying to reach her, trying to pull her back from the edge of the storm. And for the first time since she had entered the storm, Marla felt a glimmer of resistance, a faint tug in her chest that wasn't part of the Watcher. The voice, the part of her that had not been consumed, was still there. It was still alive, but as quickly as the voice had come, it was drowned out. The storm roared again, drowning everything in its fury. The Watcher's presence closed in, and the faces once again filled her mind, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. You belong to the storm. The cycle continued. The storm never stopped. And now, Marla understood. She was part of it, part of the rain, part of the Watcher. The storm was eternal, and so was she. Marla's mind stretched, unraveling at the edges as the storm consumed her. She could feel it, feel them, the souls of the forgotten ones, the faces and figures that had once been people, now trapped in the endless cycle of the rain, bound forever to the Watcher's will. Their presence was suffocating, oppressive, like 1,000 hands pressing against her skin, dragging her deeper into the void. But she was no longer herself. She wasn't the person she had been when she first stepped into that cursed town. She had been reborn into the storm. Her identity was slipping away, lost to the eternal cycle that the Watcher had created. It was a cycle that had no beginning and no end. A cycle that had claimed everyone who had come too close to the truth. The storm howled around her, an unrelenting sound that pierced the silence of the void. The rain was no longer just a natural phenomenon. It was alive, a force, a presence, that pressed in on every corner of her mind, every inch of her being. It had become part of her, and she had become part of it. She could feel it, the storm, surging through her veins, filling her lungs with its icy breath, until it seemed like there was nothing left but the Watcher, the rain, and her. In the distance, she saw the familiar shape, the Watcher, its massive form silhouetted against the infinite expanse of darkness. It was waiting for her, as it had always waited. The Watcher's form flickered, shifting, its shadows stretching and contorting like living things. It was not one entity. It was countless entities. Each face, each tortured soul that had been absorbed into the storm, now lived within it, filling it with a collective consciousness that stretched beyond time, beyond memory. You are one of us now. The voice, cold and unfeeling, echoed in her mind once more, the words reverberating like a deep, distant rumble. She couldn't tell if it was the Watcher's voice, or if it was the voices of the others, those who had already been claimed. It didn't matter, they were all the same, and then a new sound pierced the air, the knocking. It started faintly like a whisper at the edges of her consciousness, but it grew louder, more forceful, each knock shaking her to the core. The sound was different now. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from inside her. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. It was her own knock. It was her turn. She tried to move, tried to resist the pull that was dragging her forward, but she couldn't. Her body, her mind, her very essence was no longer her own. The Watcher had consumed her, and now she was the Watcher. She could feel it, the hunger, the eternal need to watch, to wait, to drag others into the storm, to claim them as part of the cycle. Her body, no longer bound by time or space, drifted toward the center of the dark void. The rain was all around her now, the droplets like tears, falling endlessly from the sky. But the rain was not just water. It was the souls of the lost, the forgotten, their voices trapped within each droplet, calling out for release, calling out for freedom that would never come. And then she saw them, the faces. They were pressed against the walls of the dark space, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. They were the ones who had come before her, the ones who had been taken by the Watcher, pulled into the cycle, and forced to become part of it. They had once been like her, alive, full of hope, of purpose. But now, they were nothing but shadows, trapped in an endless, timeless wait. Marla's form, whatever was left of her, reached out, and she could feel the Watcher's power coursing through her, her hands moving as if they had a life of their own. She was no longer Marla. She was part of the storm. She was part of the Watcher. The faces stared at her with hollow eyes, empty yet somehow pleading, begging for release. But they would never be released. They were part of the cycle now, just as she was. Join us. The whisper, now clear and haunting, seemed to echo from the very air around her, reverberating in every corner of her consciousness. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, a warning. She had been chosen. She had become the next Watcher, and with that, she understood. She was the storm now. She was the one who waited. She would stand at the edge of the rain, watching as the next soul, the next victim came into view. She would pull them in. She would consume them. The knocking grew louder. It wasn't a single knock now. It was a steady, unrelenting barrage of sound, like 1,000 fists pounding on an ancient door. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, the storm pressing against her, waiting for her to act. And then it happened. The door in front of her opened. The floodgates of the storm were lifted, and the rain began to pour faster, harder, more violently than ever before. The knocking, the pounding, came from within the door. She felt it, deep in her soul, as the door cracked open, revealing the next soul, the next victim, the one who would join her. Her eyes, if they could still be called eyes, shifted to the figure standing on the other side of the door. The person on the other side was looking for something, or someone. They didn't know the truth. They didn't understand. But they would soon. It's time. The door swung open fully, and the figure stepped forward. A man, tall and disheveled, his eyes wide with confusion as he stepped into the endless night. The rain pouring down on him. His eyes locked with hers. They were filled with terror. But there was no escape. There never had been. The knocking continued, the storm raged on, and Marla knew. The cycle had begun again. She was the Watcher now. And this was the beginning of someone else's. You're listening this because you like our story. Please like or subscribe this video to support us so we can continue to create more such videos for you. Story 2. Elias Mercer stepped out of the car and into the cold morning air, staring up at the towering mansion that now belonged to them. The house was a monolith of dark stone, its windows heavy with dust, its roof lined with gables that cast jagged shadows against the overcast sky. It had been sitting abandoned for years, untouched since the passing of its last occupant, Dr. Nathaniel Mercer, a distant relative Elias had never met. A cold wind swept through the overgrown garden as Elias approached the front door. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and with a groan of rusted hinges, the door swung open to reveal the darkened interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood and old paper, a lingering mustiness that suggested the house had been waiting, undisturbed, for its next inhabitant. Dust lay thick over the antique furniture, and the heavy curtains let in only narrow slivers of daylight, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. The silence felt expectant, as though the house itself was aware of their arrival. Elias wandered through the halls, their footsteps muffled by ornate rugs that had dulled with time. The house was vast, filled with relics of another era, portraits of stern-faced ancestors, shelves lined with books whose spines had cracked from age, marble, busts frozen in expressions of quiet contemplation. The deeper they explored, the stronger the feeling grew that the house had not been truly empty. Not really. Eventually, their path led them to the study. It was the grandest room in the house, lined with towering bookshelves that stretched to The ceiling. A massive mahogany desk sat near a window, stacks of yellowed letters scattered across its surface. A fireplace stood unused, its embers long dead. But none of these things held Elias's attention for long. Their gaze was drawn instead to the enormous mirror that dominated the far wall. The glass was wrong. It did not reflect the room properly. The dim light of the study seemed to vanish as it touched the surface, swallowed whole rather than returned. The reflection was murky, as though the mirror had been left in darkness for too long and had forgotten how to capture the world. Elias moved closer, frowning as they noticed the peculiar way the frame curled inward, its edges carved with delicate, unfamiliar symbols. It was old, much older than the house itself, and something about it set their nerves on edge. The air near the mirror felt colder. When they reached out, their fingers barely brushed the glass before they recoiled. The surface was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. A trick of temperature, they told themselves. Just an old mirror in an old house. As the day wore on, Elias tried to push the unease from their mind. They wandered through more rooms, uncovering strange details. Doors seemed slightly ajar when they could have sworn they had closed them. The heavy grandfather clock in the hall chimed at odd hours, its ticking stopping when no one was near. Paintings, though motionless, gave the uncanny impression of shifting slightly out of place when glanced at from the corner of the eye. These were small things, the kind of tricks the mind played in unfamiliar spaces. Night fell, and the house grew impossibly still. Lying in bed, Elias stared at the ceiling, their thoughts drifting back to the study, to the strange mirror that drank in the light like a bottomless well. They had been so certain, standing in front of it earlier, that something had shifted within the glass. A subtle movement, just at the edge of perception, barely noticeable, but that was ridiculous. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked. Elias sat up. The sound had come from the study. The unease that had lingered all day curled into something sharper, something close to fear. Pulling the blanket tighter around their shoulders, Elias listened, their pulse steady but alert. Minutes passed. The silence returned. It was just an old house settling, nothing more. They lay back down and closed their eyes, willing themselves to sleep. But the last thing they saw before sleep took them was the mirror, standing silently in the dark, reflecting nothing at all. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the windows, casting soft beams across the dusty floor. Elias stirred awake, the faint chill of the house still clinging to their skin. They hadn't slept well. The groans of the old mansion, the persistent creaking of wood, and the faint rustle of something in the distance had kept them tossing and turning through the night. But it was the mirror that lingered in their mind, casting an unwelcome shadow over the morning. They shook off the lingering dread and wandered down the hall toward the kitchen, their footsteps echoing softly. After brewing a bitter cup of coffee, they decided to explore more of the mansion, hoping the daylight would make the place feel less suffocating. Room by room, they peeled back dusty sheets covering antique furniture, revealing grand armoires, velvet armchairs, and delicate china. Cabinets filled with artifacts that felt too fragile to touch. But as the hours passed, their path inevitably led them back to the study. They hadn't planned on returning, but there they were, standing once more before the massive unlit mirror. The glass was murky as ever, like a fog had settled permanently within it. Elias hesitated before stepping closer, their reflection faint and distorted in the dim light. As they moved, they noticed something strange. The reflection didn't quite match their movements. When they tilted their head to the side, their reflection followed, but with a subtle delay. It wasn't much, just half a second, but it was enough to send a shiver crawling down their spine. They stepped back, their breathing quickening. The house was old, and so was the mirror. Maybe it was just warped glass or some optical illusion caused by years of tarnish. That had to be it. They turned away, determined to leave the room and distract themselves with something else. But just as they reached the doorway, a flicker of movement caught their eye, something in the mirror just beyond their reflection. Their pulse quickened as they slowly turned back toward it. Nothing. Just their own distorted image staring back at them. But they knew they had seen something. A shadow, a flicker, something moving where it shouldn't be. They approached the mirror again, leaning closer, their breath fogging the cold surface. "Just my imagination," they whispered to themselves. But their voice felt hollow in the empty room. Later that day, they tried to forget what had happened. They busied themselves with unpacking boxes and exploring more of the mansion, but the unease clung to them like a second skin. Every time they passed a reflective surface, a window, a polished doorknob, even the glass covering a framed portrait, they found themselves glancing at their reflection, half expecting it to lag behind or do something it wasn't supposed to. By evening, the house had grown cold again. Elias lit a few candles and settled in the study, sketchpad in hand. Drawing had always been their refuge, a way to focus their thoughts and push away anxiety. They sketched the fireplace, the worn leather armchair in the corner, and finally, the mirror. Their pencil traced the intricate frame, the swirling carvings that looked almost like ancient symbols. As they worked, they felt the strange weight of the mirror's presence pressing on them, like it was waiting for them to look up. And then they did. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The mirror reflected the study dimly, its surface dark and blurred. But as they stared, they noticed it again, that subtle flicker of movement within the glass. This time, it wasn't their reflection. It was something behind it. Something deeper. The figure was faint, like a shadow moving underwater. But it was there, shifting slowly in the darkness of the glass. Their breath hitched. They blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the candlelight. But the figure remained. They leaned closer, squinting at the glass, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The figure moved slowly, like it was pacing back and forth, just beyond the surface of the mirror. Elias's hand trembled as they reached out, their fingers hovering just above the glass. The air was cold, colder than before, and for a moment, they thought they heard a faint whisper, too soft to make out, but unmistakably real. Their fingers brushed the glass. It was like touching ice. Suddenly, the figure stopped moving. It turned, its form sharpening just enough for Elias to see its outline. It was humanoid, but its features were blurred, its face obscured by the dark fog within the mirror. The figure leaned forward as if peering back at them. Elias gasped and stumbled backward, their chair scraping against the floor. The mirror's surface rippled slightly, like disturbed water, before returning to its still, murky state. Their reflection stared back at them, wide-eyed and pale. Heart-pounding, Elias fled the room, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the silent halls. That night, they lay in bed, unable to sleep, their mind racing with questions they couldn't answer. What had they seen in the mirror? Was it real? Or had their imagination gotten the better of them? The mansion was old, full of creaks and whispers that could easily be explained away. But deep down, they knew the truth. Something was inside that mirror. Something that shouldn't be there. As they drifted into a restless sleep, a faint sound echoed from the study, the soft creak of floorboards, and the unmistakable whisper of something shifting just beyond the glass. Elias awoke in the dim morning light, the shadows of the mansion still heavy around them. The unsettling events of the previous night clung to their thoughts, but they pushed them aside, trying to convince themselves it was just their mind playing tricks. They were tired, alone in a strange house and under stress. It made sense, they told themselves. It had to. But when they entered the study later that day, the mirror was waiting for them, silent, still, and as dark as it had been before. The faintest shift in the air seemed to draw them closer to it. Elias hesitated, their heartbeat quickening at the memory of the shadow in the glass, the way it had moved. But there was no time to dwell on that. They had a room full of untouched canvases, sketches, and paints. They had come here to work, to escape the bustle of the world, and they needed to focus. The mirror could wait. Yet, no matter how hard Elias tried, they found themselves drawn back to it, the pull of curiosity stronger than any rational thought. With an effort, they turned away and began preparing their workspace, but the mirror's presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of their thoughts. As they began to paint, the house creaked in its usual rhythm, the groaning of the floors, the swaying of the rafters, the old pipes in the walls, but it was the mirror that kept stealing their attention. Every few minutes their eyes would wander back to it, almost without conscious thought. They noticed, too, that the reflection in the mirror seemed to change, ever so slightly, each time they glanced away. This time, when they looked at the mirror, the figure wasn't just standing there. It was moving. The vague humanoid shape was walking. No, pacing back and forth in the reflection. It was too real, too present to be ignored. Elias stared, unable to pull their eyes away. The figure's movements were too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't just a shadow. This thing was aware of them. They could see it more clearly now. Its form was human, though distorted by the fog that always surrounded it. It didn't have a face, only a vague, dark blur where the features should have been. The figure stopped, suddenly turning to face the mirror directly as if it knew Elias was watching. Elias took a step backward, their pulse racing, but the figure stayed in place, staring into the glass with eerie stillness. It didn't move, didn't blink. It simply watched. Something in the room shifted. A faint whisper, like a breath against glass, reached Elias's ears. Their hearts slammed against their ribcage as they quickly turned away from the mirror, unwilling to look any longer. They couldn't let it get to them, couldn't let themselves fall deeper into whatever this was. But the house seemed to be closing in on them. Each time Elias left the study to escape the feeling of being watched, they found themselves drawn back to the mirror. It was as if the room itself was pulling them, urging them to confront what they had seen. The whispering was constant now, an undercurrent in the air. And the figure? It hadn't moved, but its presence lingered like a dark weight, filling the entire room. The urge to draw closer grew unbearable. Elias grabbed their sketchbook and walked back to the mirror, eyes glued to the reflection. They had to understand it, had to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was just a figment of their mind, maybe a psychological trick brought on by the isolation. But something told them this was no ordinary mirror. Their reflection didn't move. Elias was certain of that much. This wasn't the mirror, simply out of sync. Their reflection stayed still, standing unnaturally rigid. It seemed to be waiting for something. But what? Slowly, they placed their fingers on the cold glass, the chill seeping into their skin. The moment their hand made contact, the air in the room grew colder still. A soft hum filled the silence. They could feel it now, a faint pressure against their palm, as if something was pushing back from the other side. Then, without warning, the figure in the mirror moved. It wasn't a gradual shift, but a sudden jerking motion. The figure stepped forward, as though crossing an invisible line. Elias stepped back in shock, their breath caught in their throat. The figure stepped out of the glass. For a brief moment there was nothing but the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath Elias's feet. The mirror's surface remained still, unbroken. But then, there it was, the figure standing in the study, just behind Elias. It was not a reflection anymore. The figure reached out, slowly, deliberately. Its hand, impossibly cold, brushed Elias's shoulder. They whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the reflection in the glass, still standing motionless. A sudden wave of dizziness crashed over Elias, and they stumbled back against the desk. Their breath came in ragged gasps as they tried to regain control of their shaking hands. The mirror reflected only themselves, the figure gone, leaving no trace except the oppressive feeling that something had changed. Something had crossed over. They could no longer ignore it. The mirror was not just a reflection. It was something far more dangerous. A portal, a link between this world and another. And that other world, the one behind the glass, was beginning to reach out. Elias stumbled backward, their heart pounding, in their chest. The door to the study slammed shut on its own, and the flickering of the candles in the room grew erratic. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own breath, the soft whispers growing louder, as though coming from all around. The figure was coming again, they realized. But this time it wasn't just watching, this time it was calling. Elias stood frozen, heart racing, eyes glued to the mirror. The oppressive silence of the room was punctuated only by the soft crackle of the fire in the corner, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The figure in the reflection, still, a vague, shadowy outline, wasn't moving. But Elias could feel it. There was something different about the way it hovered just beyond their reach, as if waiting for something. The air felt thick, heavy, and the moment stretched far longer than it should have. Elias's mind spun in confusion, attempting to rationalize the impossible. It had to be an illusion, right? Some trick of the light, some tired hallucination brought on by the isolation and the age of the house. But deep down, in a place they didn't want to acknowledge, Elias knew that was not the case. The sensation of being watched intensified. The reflection in the mirror, though still unmoving, seemed to grow more pronounced. Elias turned toward the room behind them. Everything was as it should be. The paintings on the walls, the stacks of books, the desk cluttered with papers. The room seemed ordinary, yet something felt off. There was an unease that crept into every corner, clinging to the space like a fog. They finally dared to glance at the mirror again. The figure was still there, its posture unchanged, though the absence of movement felt like the tension right before a storm breaks. Elias could almost feel the figure's presence. Could feel it stretching, its shadowy form reaching out from within the glass. It was like the reflection wasn't a mirror at all. It was alive. Elias reached out to touch the mirror again, but their fingers hovered just an inch from the glass. The cold was unbearable, as if something beyond the reflection was pulling at them, an invisible force tightening around their chest. Hesitating, they slowly placed their hand against the cold surface. This time, there was no initial shock of freezing air. Instead, a sharp tremor coursed through the glass, like an echo sent through the fabric of the room. The figure moved, a sharp intake of breath. The figure's head twitched toward them. It had never moved before, not like this. It had only ever stayed frozen, observing from the periphery. But now, its eyes, those dark, empty pits, focused on Elias. A wave of icy dread flooded through them. Elias took an involuntary step backward. The room around them seemed to tilt, as though gravity itself had shifted. The mirror, now alive with movement, seemed to stretch toward them, its surface warping and rippling as though it were becoming a doorway. The figure's hand appeared. Again, no longer a distorted blur, but a clear and deliberate motion, its fingers creeping toward the glass. It reached through. Elias stumbled back, knocking into the desk, scattering papers to the floor. The figure in the mirror mirrored their panic, its hand extending further, its body leaning toward the glass, pressing against it like a prisoner, desperate to escape. "Stop," Elias whispered to themselves, but the word came out as little more than a tremble of breath. They couldn't stop watching. The figure was trying to pull itself through to break free of its prison. Elias could feel it now, the pressure of something unnatural pushing against them from the other side. It wasn't just a reflection. It never had been. The figure's hand finally touched the glass, and when it did, the surface of the mirror shivered as if it had been struck. Elias gasped as the mirror rippled like a sheet of water disturbed by a sudden movement. It was no longer a flat reflective surface. It was now alive, a living entity that thrummed with unseen energy, pulling, stretching, warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figure's face, if it could be called that, became clearer. It was Elias's face, distorted. Yes, eyes too wide, lips too thin, an expression of deep, unshakable sadness that felt like it was mirrored from within their own soul. It was them, but not them. A realization slammed into Elias's chest with the force of a punch. This isn't just a reflection. The figure was a part of them, something that lived in the shadow of the choices they had never made. The house around them groaned as though it was shifting, settling into place. Elias could feel the pressure against their chest, the strange, overwhelming sensation that the walls were closing in. They backed away from the mirror, but it followed them, the figure's eyes never leaving them, its body twisting grotesquely in the mirror as though struggling against the constraints of the glass. The urge to run was overwhelming, but Elias found themselves rooted to the spot. Their body refused to obey. Their breath caught in their throat as the figure lifted its hand to the surface. It seemed to beckon, a silent invitation. And for the briefest moment, Elias thought they saw a flicker of recognition in the figure's eyes, a reflection of their own loneliness, their own desperation to understand, to reach through the veil. Suddenly, the glass rippled violently, sending Elias stumbling backward. They slammed into the edge of the desk, knocking a lamp to the floor. The light shattered, and the room was plunged into shadow, but the mirror still shone. For a split second, the reflection in the glass seemed to twist itself into something new. The figure that had been Elias was now becoming someone else. Not a version of themselves, no. It was becoming the version of someone Elias had forgotten, someone from their past. A person they had shut away long ago. The face in the glass wasn't just their own anymore. It was an amalgamation of them, yes, but also someone they didn't recognize, someone they had buried deep in their subconscious. The mirror had found them. It wasn't just showing Elias the reflection of their past choices. It was showing them their unmade future, the life they had abandoned, the person they could have been if they hadn't made all those decisions. And now it was calling to them. Suddenly, the whisper returned, faint but clear. Come closer, come back, join us. A chill ran through Elias's entire being. There was no denying it anymore. The mirror was not just showing them an image. It was offering something, a way to become that other version of themselves, to step through the mirror into another life. Elias's breath caught in their throat. Could they? Could they leave everything behind? Step through the glass and let it take them somewhere else, somewhere where they didn't have to be this person anymore. Before they could answer, the mirror shattered. The glass broke with an audible crack, sending shards spraying across the room. But the figure was still there, standing in the reflection, untouched by the chaos around it. Elias's heart pounded as they watched the room fill with a dark mist, swirling in patterns they couldn't comprehend. They reached out, drawn to the mirror's shattered surface, and their fingers brushed against the fragments of glass, feeling a cold like death itself. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was clear, as though it had passed from the mirror to Elias's own mind. Come into the mirror and never look back. The sound of glass shattering echoed in Elias's ears, louder than it had any right to be. The fragments of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, each piece reflecting not just the study, but something else, something that wasn't supposed. to be there. For a brief, terrifying moment, the room seemed to pulse, as if the very walls were breathing with some ancient, unseen force. Elias stood frozen in place, heart pounding, eyes locked on the mirror's remains. The reflection was gone. The figure had vanished. But something in the air was different. The mist that had begun to creep from the shattered glass was no longer ethereal. It was tangible, like smoke that clung to the edges of the room, slowly, creeping toward them, filling the space with an oppressive chill. For a moment, everything was still. The house groaned, the old timbers shifting and settling, but Elias couldn't shake the sense that the room had changed. They were no longer just in a study. They were in the space between two worlds, caught somewhere just outside of reality. Elias stepped forward, their movements slow, as though they were wading through thick water. They were afraid to touch the broken glass, afraid that if they did, they would fall through, swallowed by whatever lay on the other side. The mist swirled at their feet, like it was beckoning them, urging them closer. It was thick now, swirling in tiny, insistent spirals, and the room seemed to grow colder, darker with every passing second. The house had always felt unsettling, but now it felt like it was alive. The walls felt like they were watching. The air seemed to hum with something unknown, and every breath Elias took was cold, as though the world itself had turned inhospitable. Shaking, Elias moved toward the door. They couldn't stay in this room. The mirror was gone, shattered beyond repair, and with it the presence that had haunted them. Or so they thought. But the sensation of being watched hadn't left. The hairs on the back of their neck prickled, a gnawing feeling in their gut that something was lurking just beyond their vision. When they reached the doorway, the house seemed to sigh, an almost imperceptible noise, like a breath held for too long. And then, the door slammed shut. Elias jumped back, stumbling as the door rattled in its frame. For a second, they thought it was the wind, but there had been no breeze in the room, no shift in the air. It was as if something had pushed the door closed from the other side. Panic surged within them, and they turned to the windows, desperate to escape. But the once clear panes of glass were now fogged, obscured by a layer of mist that clung to the edges like a fog rising from the ground. Elias pounded on the door, trying to open it, but the handle refused to budge. It was locked from the inside. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to press in around them, the ceiling lower, the corners darker. The distant creaking of the house, the faint murmurs in the distance. They were all wrong. Everything was wrong. And then, from the far corner of the room, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees, but Elias could hear them now, distinct words rising above the murmur, though they couldn't make out the language. It was like a voice beneath their thoughts, scratching at their mind with words they didn't understand. Elias turned quickly, searching the shadows, but there was no one there. The mist had thickened further, coiling around the legs of the desk, and the scattered chairs creeping along the edges of the floor. The whispers grew louder, not from a single direction, but from all around them, like an invisible presence closing in. A sound like many voices speaking all at once, a choir of the lost, reverberated in the space. "Stop it," Elias whispered, to themselves, backing up toward the study's far wall. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." But the whispers only grew more insistent. They were familiar now, and the realization that the voices weren't foreign, that they had heard these words before, sent a shiver crawling up Elias's spine. The whispers weren't just disembodied sounds. They were speaking to Elias. And then, a figure stepped out of the mist. Elias froze, unable to breathe, their heart hammering in their chest. The figure wasn't entirely solid, but its outline was clear, A tall figure, draped in tattered clothes, a shadow of their own reflection, but different, distorted. The figure's face was obscured by a patch of blackness, a void that seemed to swallow any detail. Elias couldn't make out its eyes, its mouth, there was nothing. Just a shifting void of shadow. The figure's outline blurred at the edges, like smoke in the wind. Elias felt a cold sweat break out across their skin as they realized what they were seeing. It was them, or rather, it was an unmade version of themselves, something that should not exist. This wasn't just a shadow. This was a lost version, a reflection of a choice never made, a life that didn't happen. The figure moved toward them slowly, its limbs bending at odd angles as if it were never meant to walk, as if it didn't know how to move through this world. Its body seemed to flicker like a bad television signal, and every time Elias tried to focus on its face, it blurred further. Who? What are you? Elias managed to choke out, voice trembling. They backed into the wall, pressing their palms against the cold stone. But the figure didn't stop. It came closer, each step dragging the air with it, like the weight of the room itself was shifting. The figure raised a hand, and Elias felt the coldness, the freezing, suffocating chill that seemed to radiate from it. The touch of its fingers was like ice against their skin, though it never actually made contact. It was as if the figure was reaching for something, reaching for them. Elias flinched, their breath shallow, as the figure's arm moved closer. They could hear their own heartbeat pounding in their ears, louder now, almost deafening. The figure's mouth opened, though there was no face beneath the blackness. The voice that came out wasn't real, wasn't physical, but it echoed through their mind like a scream. You left me behind. You abandoned me. Now you must join me. Elias recoiled in horror, their hands trembling as they tried to push the figure back, but their fingers slipped through the air, passing through empty space. The figure's presence was suffocating. Its words were an impenetrable fog. It was coming closer, closer still. Its hand stretched forward again. In desperation, Elias lunged for the door handle, turning it once more, frantic, but the lock didn't budge. They were trapped, alone, with the figure, and the suffocating sense of something terrible closing in around them. Their heart was pounding too fast, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the room shifted. The mist rose higher and the walls seemed to warp. The figure wasn't just in the room anymore. It was inside Elias's head. They couldn't escape. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how fast they moved, it was too late. The figure's shadow had already overtaken them, and then, as if in response to their panic, the mirror returned. It wasn't there, physically, but in the reflection of the room, Elias saw the mirror's surface. And in it, they saw not just the room they were trapped in, but something else, another version of themselves, standing in the study. This version was smiling, as if inviting them in. Elias knew in that moment they were no longer in control. The mirror had taken them. It had taken everything. Elias's mind spun as they stared at the figure in the reflection, the smile on their own face, an expression they did not remember ever making, growing wider, colder. It was like looking into a mirror that wasn't their own. They felt the distinct sense that they were losing themselves, that the person they saw staring back at them was not just a distorted version of who they were. It was someone they had never been, someone they could never be. The room seemed to warp around them, growing darker as the reflection began to shift. The walls stretched and narrowed, the once familiar room now feeling more like a cage. The figure in the mirror, their reflection, continued to smile, but its eyes now seemed to know something Elias didn't. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a gateway, and the figure was beckoning them, pulling them deeper into that space. Elias tried to turn away, to run, but the room itself felt as if it had locked them in. The misting shadow that had emerged from the broken mirror seemed to coil around them, pressing in from all sides, suffocating them. The air was thick, as though the house was absorbing every breath they took. The whispers, the voices, they were louder now, as if they were speaking directly into Elias's mind, pushing them toward the figure. That thing in the mirror was not just their reflection. It was something else, a shadow self, waiting, wanting. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, as if it were studying Elias, watching them struggle. The smile widened even more, until it looked inhuman, stretching too far, twisting like a macabre grin. And then it spoke. "Why do you resist, Elias?" The voice was soft, almost sweet, but it sent a shiver straight down their spine. "You know what you must do." Elias staggered back, gasping, their breath coming in ragged bursts. Their hands shook as they reached for the door, desperate to escape. But the room felt smaller now. The door was still locked, the key nowhere to be found. It was the mirror. They knew it then. The mirror had become more than just a reflective surface. It was something alive, a doorway to another place. The cold fog from the shattered glass began to creep along the floor, thickening as it filled the corners of the room. The mist seemed to curl around Elias's ankles, freezing their very soul as it wrapped around them. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was reaching out, pulling, threatening to consume them. Elias turned back to the mirror, their gaze unwillingly drawn once more to the smiling, waiting figure. What did it want from them? The reflection now looked more like Elias than ever, with features sharper, eyes darker, and the grin more cruel, mocking their every thought. It stepped forward, as if moving through the glass itself, breaking the boundary between what was real and what had been trapped inside. "You don't need to fight it, Elias." The figure's voice, now all too familiar, whispered directly in their ear. It was as if the figure was standing beside them. The air grew colder. "You've already been here. You've already chosen." "No," Elias muttered, shaking their head. "No, I haven't." But the figure was too real. The voice, now an echo in their own mind, continued. "You've always known, haven't you? You've always been afraid of the person you could become, of the choices you've made. That's why you're drawn to the mirror, to see what could have been, what should have been." The figure's hand pressed flat against the glass. Elias gasped, the words sinking deep into their chest as the fog around them thickened, pressing in with weight that felt almost suffocating. Their breath came out in jagged gasps, a feeling of dread curling tightly around their heart. The mirror wasn't just reflecting them. It was showing them the version they had never chosen, the version that could have existed had they made a different decision in their life, had they chosen to follow a different path. "You're me," Elias whispered to the mirror. The words were hollow, but they felt real. The figure in the glass was everything they feared, everything they tried to suppress. "I'm you, and you are me." The reflection's grin widened even more, almost stretching too wide. "We are the same, you and I. You can't run from what you've become, but you can embrace it. Come to me. Step through. Join me. You've always known that's where you belong." Elias's head was spinning, their body frozen as they stared at the reflection, unable to pull away. The whispers, the voices were growing louder, pressing against their mind. "Come closer. Join us. You belong with us. You've always belonged." They felt the mirror's pull, a gravitational force, as though the glass were becoming a vacuum, pulling everything into it. They could see it now, the path they hadn't taken, the life that could have been theirs. They could feel the magnetic attraction to that version of themselves, the life without mistakes, without regret. The figure in the mirror stretched forward as if trying to reach them, its arms crossing over the boundary of the glass and into the room. Elias's pulse hammered in their chest, but their body refused to move, paralyzed in place by fear, by longing. They wanted to know what that life would have been like. They wanted to know if this version of them, the one in the mirror, the one free of mistakes, free of the weight of regret, was the better version, the version that had it all together, the one who was never alone. But deep down, they knew the truth. This was no salvation. This wasn't the other side offering a new beginning. This was a trap. This was the mirror offering nothing more than a lie. It wasn't about choices, it was about control, about the reflection taking over. The reflection smiled, and it wasn't Elias anymore. It was something else. It was something that wasn't supposed to exist. You were never meant to stay in this world. Come, and I will show you what you truly are. Suddenly, the air shifted. The room seemed to shift. The walls stretched inward as the mirror seemed to ripple, warping like liquid glass, the surface becoming an entrance. Elias could feel the air growing thinner, their chest tightening as if the very act of breathing was becoming impossible. In that moment, Elias wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But the pull was stronger now, drawing them closer to the mirror, to the reflection, to the life they had forsaken. Their hand reached toward it, trembling, the boundary between what was real and what was imagined, what was lived and what was wished for, blurring with each second. But as their fingers hovered over the surface of the glass, something deep within them flickered. A memory, a forgotten thought, a warning. They could feel their own will returning, a fight that had not yet been lost. They could not, would not, become this thing. The mirror wanted them to forget who they were, to join with it and vanish into the other side. But Elias was still here. They stepped back, their feet shaking beneath them, their hand falling away from the mirror. The reflection's smile vanished. It had lost. The glass trembled violently, the fog in the room swarming like a storm. The whispers began to distort, the voices turning into a single horrible scream. Elias ran. Elias's heart thundered in their chest as they ran, their feet slipping on the polished wood floor, every sense focused on the cacophony of their own breath and the growing sound of the whispers that swirled around them. The house felt alive. Now, the walls shifting, the shadows deepening, as if the entire mansion had become a living, breathing thing. Each step they took only seemed to push them deeper into something unnatural. The door, the one they had tried to open earlier, still wouldn't budge. The windows, once clear, were now veiled by thick, choking fog, like the house itself was pushing them into a corner. As Elias stumbled toward the front door again, the coldness in the air intensified. The room around them seemed to stretch impossibly, long, warping with every frantic breath they took. A low, guttural sound rose from behind them, an unearthly groan that echoed through the house, and Elias felt a weight settle onto their shoulders, a sense of pressure that seemed to constrict their very lungs. They turned quickly, but the room was still empty, empty except for the distant shadows clinging to the corners of the space. The figure, the reflection, hadn't followed them physically, but it was still there, lingering in the back of their mind. Elias's thoughts were tangled, disjointed. Their breath came in quick, shallow bursts, and every movement felt slow, deliberate, as though something else was moving them, guiding them, pulling them toward the inevitable. They were trapped. There was no escape. Turning again towards the study, Elias realized something was wrong with the house itself. The floorboards seemed to groan and creak with a sound they hadn't heard before. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old building settling. This was something far more unnatural. The walls were bending inward, as if the house was shrinking, pressing them into a suffocating embrace. The air grew thicker. Suddenly the mirror flashed back into Elias's mind, its presence filling their thoughts like a dark flood, the distorted version of themselves, now more real than the physical world around them. The figure in the glass, it was watching, waiting. They slammed their hand against the study door in desperation, but it was locked. Elias tried the door handle, yanking at it, but the wood felt like it was shifting beneath their touch, bending inwards and warping as if the door itself were alive. "Let me out!" Elias shouted, though they weren't sure if they were speaking to the house, the mirror, or even the version of themselves that still haunted them from across the glass. But the voices, the whispers, began to shift, to grow louder. Elias could hear them crackling in their head, filling the room with the sound of hundreds of disembodied voices. It was the house. It was the mirror. It was them. Everything was melding together. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers became clear. "Come back to me." The voice wasn't their own. It was deeper, colder, laced with something ancient, something dark. The sound was rich with hunger, a desire to consume. Elias recoiled, but the floor shifted again, making their balance falter. Their legs wobbled beneath them, and they collapsed to their knees, the chill creeping deeper into their bones. They could feel something brushing the edges of their mind, something trying to reach them. It wasn't the mirror anymore. It was as if the house itself was feeding off their fear. The air thickened even further, as if a great weight had pressed down on them from all directions, a slow, suffocating pressure. Then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was an emptiness so deep it felt like the house was holding its breath. Elias slowly stood, uncertain of what they might find. It wasn't the same study anymore. The room had changed. The furniture seemed to be swallowed by shadow. The once ornate desk now just an empty husk, its drawers opened and spilling out torn papers. The paintings on the walls no longer framed portraits of strangers, but images that flickered, distorted, alive, moved unnaturally, their subjects seemingly twisting and contorting. Elias's breath hitched. But worst of all, the mirror. The mirror was there again. The figure was not only in the glass, it had stepped through. Elias backed away, their skin cold, their breath shallow, panic taking over every thought. The figure, their reflection, no longer distorted but full of terrible detail, was standing just beyond the surface of the glass, its darkened form now clearly separated from the mist. The room was almost identical, but the reflection in the glass was unmistakably alive, filled with some twisted energy, and its eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, looked straight at them. For a moment, Elias thought they would drown in the depth of the gaze, like sinking into an abyss. Then, the figure began to move, taking slow, deliberate steps across the room. Elias's hands shook, their body frozen in place, unable to tear their gaze away. The figure's every motion mirrored theirs, but somehow it was more real, more solid than the world they stood in. The figure reached out, not just into the mirror, but toward Elias. Its hand pressed against the glass, slowly pushing through as though the boundaries between this world and the mirror were melting away. And then it spoke. "Come, join me. You've always known the choice." The voice was a low whisper, but it resonated in Elias's mind, as though it came from every corner of the house. "You are me. You are this. You cannot escape what you've always been." The world around. Elias spun. The room blurred into shadows and the mist grew thick, pulling them toward the figure like the hand of some unseen force. Their reflection beckoned them, drawing them closer, reaching toward them from the other side of the glass. Elias took a step back, but their body moved against their will. The mirror had become an extension of them, as if it were a place that held their very soul, their essence, something that had always been there, waiting to return. They could feel themselves being pulled toward it, their feet moving of their own accord. The whisper grew louder, louder, like the ringing of a bell in their mind. I will take you. I will become you. Elias stumbled forward, their hands stretching out as if they were meant to meet the reflection halfway. Their fingers brushed the glass, but it wasn't cold. It was warm, alive. The sensation of touching it was like sinking into something deep, something ancient. The glass had become soft, pliable, as though it were no longer a barrier at all. Suddenly, the door to the study slammed open with a force that shook the walls. Elias snapped their head around, their heart racing. The figure in the mirror froze, just as suddenly as it had moved, its gaze still fixed on Elias. The air shifted again, and the mist began to retreat, but the figure didn't move. The door stayed open. A voice echoed from the threshold. Elias, get away from it, now. Elias turned, eyes wide, but the room seemed to blur again, and for a fleeting moment they saw someone standing in the doorway. It wasn't their reflection. It was a person, a woman, young, frantic, eyes filled with terror. She was dripping with water, like she had just stepped out of some ancient pool, wet, freezing, her clothes clinging to her skin. Her hand reached out toward Elias. Please, you have to leave it. It's not you. Elias opened their mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The figure in the mirror stepped closer. The glass rippled, stretching. And then the woman screamed, Elias! The scream echoed through the study, reverberating off the walls like a cracked bell, sending a shockwave of cold through Elias's spine. They blinked, their minds struggling to focus, still half drowned by the pull of the figure in the mirror. Its inhuman eyes staring into them as though it were waiting, no, expecting them to step through. But the woman's voice, filled with panic and urgency, broke through the fog that clouded their thoughts. Elias. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but Elias could feel its presence, pressing, suffocating, waiting for them to cross the threshold. It wanted them, needed them. It was almost as though the room itself was holding its breath, the house leaning in, waiting for Elias to make the final decision. But in the doorway stood the woman, her eyes wide with terror, her pale, wet skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the study. Elias's breath caught in their throat as the woman took another step forward, the trembling in her hands visible even from across the room. She was real, too real, and yet she looked so out of place, standing there like an apparition pulled from some forgotten nightmare. She reached out toward Elias, her hand trembling as if she too were fighting the same pull that threatened to consume them both. Elias, please. Her voice cracked, desperate. You have to listen to me. This place, it's not real anymore. Don't let it take you. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The air was so thick that Elias could taste it, like iron, like blood. Their heart pounded erratically, a sharp, painful beat in their chest. The mist around them had retreated, but the room still felt suffocating, as if it were too small, as though it couldn't contain everything that was happening. The mirror, once a passive reflection, had turned into something alive. Elias could feel it watching them, waiting. It was ready to pull them in. The woman's words, though frantic, were like a tether pulling them back, away from the void that threatened to swallow them whole. Elias's feet were still rooted to the floor, their body unwilling to move, as though it had been frozen in place by the very nature of the house itself. The figure in the mirror did not blink, did not shift. It stood there, motionless, as though it had all the time in the world to wait. You don't know what it wants. The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, full of sorrow, as if she was speaking from experience. You think it's you, think it's your reflection. But it's not. It's a lie. It's a part of you that never existed. Elias swallowed, the words gnawing at their mind like an insistent, unwelcome truth. Was this all just a game of the mind? A twisted reflection of their own regrets and unmade decisions? Or was there something else, something darker? They turned their eyes back to the figure, now standing too close to the glass, so close they could see the strange distortion of its face, like it was slowly losing its form. It wanted them. No. Elias took a half step back, their breath short, their bodies screaming to get away, but their feet wouldn't move. I don't understand. What do you mean it's not me? They gestured helplessly to the mirror, the figure still watching them, an impossible mockery of themselves. It looks like me. The woman's face twisted with pain as she shook her head. No, Elias. It's a reflection of the life you could have had. It's all the choices you didn't make, all the lives you could have lived, but didn't. It's not you. It's what you left behind. And now, it wants you. She paused, her voice growing softer, as if she were speaking from a place of deep regret. The mirror, it doesn't just show you your reflection. It remembers you. It keeps the pieces of your soul that you've abandoned. And once it has them, it pulls you in, traps you in its world, and takes your place. The air felt suddenly heavier, thicker, as if the weight of her words was starting to press down on Elias's very soul. They couldn't breathe. The idea was too much to process, too terrifying to even comprehend. The figure in the mirror wasn't just some trick of light or glass. It was an entity, a presence that had been waiting for them to approach, to enter. And now it had its sights set on them. The woman took another step forward, her soaked clothes clinging to her frail form. Elias, please, you have to come with me. We have to leave, before it's too late. Something in her voice seemed familiar, an echo of a memory they couldn't quite place. The desperation in her eyes, the way she moved toward them like a lifeline, made them feel something stir deep within. Fear, confusion. The house felt darker now, the shadows closing in around them as the figure in the mirror continued to stare. It was as though the house itself was waiting for them to make their move. Without warning, the temperature in the room dropped, sharp, icy cold, like a breath of winter creeping under their skin. Elias gasped, their body trembling involuntarily. The air was alive now, crackling with an energy that felt ancient, hungry, and then the figure spoke. The voice that echoed from its lips was not the same whisper from before. This time it was louder, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the walls. It wasn't Elias's voice, nor their reflections. It was something more. You belong with me. The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping with the intensity of the words. Elias felt dizzy, their vision narrowing as the air grew thick with shadow. The figure moved again, but this time it wasn't a mirror image. It was coming for them, stepping forward through the glass, reaching toward them with its outstretched hand. No! Elias gasped, falling to their knees, desperately trying to back away. Their heart raced, each breath coming in shallow gasps, as they pressed themselves against the farthest corner of the room. They were trapped. The door was locked. The windows closed. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a heartbeat that wasn't their own. And then, the woman spoke. Once more, it's coming for you, Elias. It's already taken part of you. It's inside the house, and if you don't leave now... But Elias didn't hear her. They were too focused on the figure, its hand now just inches from their own, the air between them vibrating with energy. They could feel its presence, the power in that hand, and the incredible pull drawing them closer. They were helpless, trapped. The room was no longer the study. The walls had shifted, the mirrors had warped, and in their mind, Elias saw the reflection of a new life. The life they hadn't chosen, the one that had haunted them, the one that was now within reach. The mirror didn't just want to show them the reflection, it wanted to take them. "No!" Elias screamed. The sound echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls and the floor, vibrating through the air. And the figure in the mirror moved. It stepped forward, crossing the threshold between two worlds. Elias's scream hung in the air, trembling with desperation. But the figure in the mirror seemed unfazed, its grotesque smile widening as it crossed the threshold into the room. Every inch it moved made the walls of the study feel smaller, as though the space itself were being devoured by its presence. Elias could feel the weight of it, like the room was collapsing inward, pressing down on them from every direction. The woman, still standing at the doorway, reached out with trembling hands, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias, you have to go now. It will take you. It already has." The figure's presence seemed to grow with each passing second, its shape becoming more defined, more solid, and Elias's heart pounded in their chest. The air had grown icy, the temperature dropping so sharply it was as if the house itself had come alive and was breathing alongside them, its pulse quickening. The shadows clung to the walls, spiraling toward the center of the room, making it feel like the house was folding in on itself. But Elias couldn't move. Their body was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that the figure, the reflection, was no longer just a part of the mirror. It was here, in the room with them. It was alive, standing in front of them, its dark eyes locked onto theirs, watching, waiting. And then the whispers began again, louder, sharper, more insistent. The voices weren't just around them anymore. They were inside their head, crawling through their thoughts like cold fingers. The sound of their name echoed through their mind over and over, drowning out all other thoughts. "Elias, Elias, you are mine." The words were soothing, hypnotic, as though the figure's voice was slipping inside their skull and weaving itself into their very being. It wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't a phantom or a trick of the glass. It was a part of Elias, something they had buried deep within themselves, something that had never been allowed to surface. Something that was pulling them back into the darkness. "Come to me, Elias, embrace who you really are." The figure's hand, long and thin, reached out toward them, its fingers stretching through the air like shadows, too long, too unnatural. The woman in the doorway gasped and took a step back, but Elias could hardly focus on her anymore. All they could see was that hand, that terrible, cold hand reaching closer. The urge to step toward it was undeniable. Elias wanted to go to it. It was like the hand was calling them, pulling them into the embrace of something they had longed for, something familiar yet terrifying, the promise of escaping the confusion, of letting go of the pain. It seemed so easy. It seemed like it would make everything stop. Everything would be simpler. But then a voice, the voice of the woman, broke through. "Elias, don't let it take you. Don't let it become you." Her words pierced through the haze of terror and desire that clouded Elias's mind. They blinked, refocusing, and the pull of the mirror seemed to falter just for a moment. Their own reflection in the glass shifted, the face that was once them becoming a monster, a twisted thing. Their reflection had become something other. It was no longer a part of them. It was something that was taking them, with the last bit of strength they had. Elias tore their eyes away from the mirror and looked at the woman. Her face was pale, but there was something in her eyes, determination, a desperation that Elias recognized. The woman wasn't a stranger. She couldn't, but she had to be someone important, someone who understood this place. The figure in the mirror took another step toward them, its shadow stretching across the room, enveloping the walls, the ceiling, and the floor. Elias could feel the suffocating pressure of it. It was closing. "You can't fight this, Elias. You can't escape it. It is you. It has always been you." The figure's voice was deepening, growing louder, until it felt like it was coming from all directions. Elias tried to move again, but their feet wouldn't obey. Their body was locked, anchored in place by the invisible grip the figure had on them. The walls of the room were pulsing, the entire house breathing with it, as though it were becoming one entity. The figure had always been a part of this place. It was a piece of the house, a piece of the mirror, and it had been waiting for Elias to come back, to cross the threshold. No, Elias gasped, but the word barely escaped their lips. The woman took another step forward, her eyes wild with fear. "You have to leave the house. The mirror is the key. The only way to stop it." But before she could finish, the air exploded with a violent force. The figure in the mirror surged forward, crashing into the room with such intensity that the walls shuddered. Elias was thrown backward, tumbling to the ground, their head ringing. The house groaned as if it were being torn apart, the foundation trembling underfoot. The woman's voice was drowned out by the crash of furniture toppling over and the shattering of glass. Elias struggled to their feet, pain shooting through their body, and looked around in a panic. The figure had broken through the glass, stepping out of the frame, its shadowy form now fully manifested in the room, hovering inches above the floor. The darkness it brought with it seemed to swallow the light in the room, making the space feel like a suffocating void. Elias's pulse hammered in their ears. They could feel it now. The figure was part of them. It wasn't just a reflection. They had created it, summoned it. It was a manifestation of everything they had buried deep inside themselves, their regrets, their failures, their fears. It wasn't just their reflection, but the version of themselves they had feared becoming. The version that had been trapped in the mirror, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "You can't escape, Elias." The figure's voice was a low, guttural whisper. It had become more than just a voice. It was a presence that filled the room, seeping into their thoughts, their very soul. "I am you, and you are me." The woman rushed to Elias's side, grabbing their arm, pulling them toward the door. But the moment their fingers touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the walls rumbling as though the house itself was rejecting them, holding them inside. "Leave now. Elias, please." The woman's voice broke, but Elias couldn't understand her. The figure had stepped closer. Its eyes burned like hollow flames, and its form seemed to stretch as it grew stronger. The room closed in around them, the walls thickening with shadows, the light dimming until it was all swallowed by the abyss. In the suffocating dark, Elias couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The whisper in their head grew louder, and then they remembered. The key. Elias's hands fumbled for the key, the one they'd found in the drawer, the key that had been left behind by Dr. Nathaniel Mercer. It was the only way out. With all the strength they had left, Elias shoved the key into the lock. The door creaked, but then it burst open with a sound like the house itself giving way. The figure screamed in fury, but Elias didn't look back. They ran. They didn't stop. Elias's feet pounded against the floor as they raced down the hallway, their breath ragged and desperate, chest heaving with the weight of panic. The door to the study had burst open, and they had barely managed to escape the suffocating grip of the shadow that had pulled them toward the mirror. The house itself seemed to fight them, the walls closing in, the air pressing down on them with unnatural force. The very structure of the mansion felt like it was alive, twisting and bending to keep them inside. Every step was heavy, as though the house itself were weighing them down, urging them to turn back, to return to the place of the reflection, where the figure waited patiently, its hollow eyes still burning in their memory. But Elias couldn't stop. They had no choice but to push forward, to keep running, to escape whatever twisted force had taken hold of the house. The hallway stretched before them, longer than it had any right to be, and with every step they took, the darkness seemed to deepen, as though the house were following them, looming just beyond the reach of their fading sanity. The house groaned in protest, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the walls. Elias looked over their shoulder for a moment, the shadows closing in behind them, the flickering lights casting strange shapes on the walls, like shadows of lost things. The mirror, the figure, the house, it was all intertwined. Every corner of the mansion seemed to pulse with an energy, a darkness, a malevolent force that sought to consume them, to trap them inside. But the key was in their hand. It was the only thing that might give them a chance at survival. The key to the mansion. Elias's heart raced as they fumbled for the key, their hands trembling with adrenaline and fear. They had to get out. They had to find a way to destroy the mirror, to break the connection that had been made. They had to make it stop. They ran down the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty, cavernous halls. The mansion was larger than they had ever realized, with endless corridors and rooms that stretched into the darkness. Each step they took felt like it was leading them deeper into some terrible unknown. But there was no time to question it now. They had to escape. The front door was just ahead, the heavy wooden frame looming like a beacon of hope. It was still locked. Of course it was. The house didn't want them to leave. The walls shook again, and the air seemed to crackle with a strange energy, like an invisible force pressing down on them. Elias reached for the key again, their fingers slick with sweat, and shoved it into the door's lock. The metal was cold against their skin, and the key turned with a jarring click that sent a jolt through their spine. The door groaned, its ancient hinges protesting as they pushed against it. The barricade lifted, and for the first time since they had arrived in the mansion, the world beyond felt like a distant, unreachable haven. The sunlight, pale and weak, filtered through the gap in the door. They pushed it open, only to be met with the sound of scraping metal. From the corner of their eye they saw it. The figure, the one from the mirror. It had followed them. It was standing in the doorway, blocking their exit. The figure's form was now more solid than ever, more real, its features twisted and contorted into something unrecognizable, but it was there. It was them. Elias could see the slight flicker of their own reflection in the figure's eyes. "You can't leave, Elias." The figure's voice was deep, distorted, as though it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. It wasn't their reflection's voice anymore. It was a growl, a rumble that echoed in the back of Elias's mind. "This is where you belong. This is where you are meant to stay." Elias took a step back, heart thundering in their chest. "No." The figure's hand reached out, not slowly, but with ferocious speed, its fingers twisted and long, reaching for them. Elias stumbled back, terrified. But the figure wasn't just standing in front of the door. It was inside their mind, pushing against their thoughts, against their will. It wanted them. "No! You're not me!" Elias screamed, though their voice sounded small and weak in the vast emptiness of the hallway. They didn't know how they had the strength left, but they couldn't stop now. They couldn't. They had to fight. The figure's smile twisted. It grinned as it stepped forward, its form writhing as if it were made of the very shadows that filled the house. The figure seemed to stretch out, growing taller and taller, filling the doorway, blocking their only escape. "I am you," the figure repeated, its voice a dark echo that reverberated in Elias's mind. "I have always been you. You can't run away from yourself." The reflection reached out again. This time, it wasn't just reaching through the glass. It was reaching through Elias's mind, through their very thoughts. The air grew even colder, the oppressive weight of the house growing unbearable. The shadows stretching, reaching for them, wrapping around them like fingers. Elias's mind reeled with the pressure. They could feel the figure's presence, its darkness sinking deeper into them. It was pulling them in, drawing them closer to the mirror, to that place where it could consume them, replace them. They had to break free. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air like thunder, and Elias staggered back, their breath catching. The door behind them, the only way out, began to close of its own accord, the heavy wood scraping against the frame. It was as if the house was trying to seal them in, to trap them once again. "No!" Elias shouted, desperate now, their pulse racing faster. "I won't become you! I won't!" In that moment, something shifted inside them. Something inside snapped. The pressure, the suffocating darkness, the whispers, they all became too much. Elias bent down, gripping the key in their hand, and with every ounce of strength they could muster, they slammed it into the doorframe and turned it. The key glowed with a bright, violent light, illuminating the entire space. The figure screamed, a terrible, soul-ripping scream, and shuddered as if it were being pulled back into the glass. The door, once heavy and oppressive, suddenly felt light, as if the weight of the house had been lifted. Elias shoved the door open with a force that sent them stumbling into the light outside, their breath ragged, their mind spinning. They were free. They had escaped. For a moment, everything was still. The mansion loomed behind them, its silhouette jagged and dark against the pale sky. The house was silent now, its twisted form standing motionless. But Elias knew, deep down, that the figure was still there. It had not let go. The mirror, the figure, the mansion. It would follow them. It would always follow them, until they broke the connection for good. With shaking hands, Elias closed the door behind them, and as they stepped away from the house, they looked back only once. The figure was standing in the window, its face now clear, staring at them with empty eyes. The door to the house hadn't closed. It never would. Elias stumbled away from the mansion, the ground beneath them uneven, as though the earth itself were trying to push them back toward the house, urging them to return to the place where they had once stood. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their chest heaving with every step as they forced their legs to carry them farther from the mansion. But no matter how far they walked, the unease never left. The figure, the reflection, they were still there, just behind the walls of the house. In the cracks of their mind, waiting for them to turn back, they had escaped. But the feeling of the house's grip still lingered, tightening around their throat, like invisible fingers, squeezing with every breath. The mansion stood in the distance, its silhouette against the sky seeming almost alive, as though it were watching them, waiting. Elias could still feel its presence, its eyes, 1,000 eyes, fixed on them, though the house remained silent. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a strange sense of freedom. They had been running for so long, trying to escape, to outrun the things that haunted them, the choices that had defined them. The mansion, with all its dark history, was now behind them, but the weight of it remained, heavy on their shoulders. And then, without warning, the earth shifted beneath their feet, pulling them back toward the mansion. Elias froze, their heart skipping a beat. The ground wasn't shaking, not exactly, but something in the air had changed. The space around them seemed to shift, the landscape warping, the trees blurring into one another. The wind, once crisp and cold, now felt wrong, too heavy, too suffocating. It whispered through the air in a language they couldn't understand, an ancient sound that felt like a warning. Elias glanced over their shoulder, and there it was, the mansion, standing just as it had before, but closer, somehow, as if the distance between them had shrunk to nothing. It wasn't possible. The house had been miles away just moments ago. They had walked miles from it, but now it was right there, looming in front of them, like an insurmountable wall, impossibly close. Panic surged through Elias's veins, the realization sinking in that they hadn't truly escaped. The mansion had never let them go. It was drawing them back. No matter how far they ran, how fast they tried to flee, the house would never release them. It was always there, just behind their thoughts, just beyond their reach, waiting for them to return. You can't leave. The voice came from the house itself, low, echoing, familiar. It was the figure's voice, now an undeniable presence inside Elias's mind. You are mine. You will always be mine. Elias turned sharply, their pulse pounding in their ears, but they saw no one. The house loomed over them, its windows dark and empty, as though it were watching from a distance, waiting for them to step back inside. You belong here. The voice was everywhere, curling around them, wrapping around their mind. The pressure was building again, the house trying to pull them in, to draw them back. Come back to me. Come back to the mirror. Elias squeezed their eyes shut, clenching their fists. The figure in the mirror was still there, somewhere inside their thoughts, its cold eyes fixed on them. But this wasn't just the mirror. It wasn't just a reflection. It was everything. The figure had been a part of them, something they had abandoned, something that had never truly left. The feeling of the house tightening its grip was overwhelming. The voices in the distance, whispers, commands, pleas, grew louder, swirling around them, drowning out everything else. The house was becoming more than just a physical place. It was a presence. It was alive, and it wanted them. Suddenly, the ground beneath Elias's feet gave way, not in a physical sense, but in something deeper, more visceral. The earth cracked, and the landscape seemed to shift, splitting and shifting like it was being torn apart by some unseen force. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was an entity, a thing with a will of its own. The mist, thick and suffocating, began to rise around them again, clinging to their body, making it hard to breathe. You belong here. The voice now sounded hollow, distant, yet all-encompassing. It echoed through every corner of their mind, reverberating in the air. It was coming from the house, the mirror, the figure. It was coming from everywhere. The shadows around them thickened, coiling like snakes, waiting to drag them back. Elias could feel their legs trembling, their body wanting to collapse under the pressure of the house's pull. They had fought so hard to escape, to run from the darkness, but it was all closing in. And then, a flash of light. A shimmering light cut through the fog, momentarily piercing the oppressive darkness. The figure in the mirror had always been a shadow, a distorted reflection. But in that moment, Elias saw something else. A silhouette. Something moving through the light. A figure, not just of darkness, but of light, radiant, warm, and full of life. It wasn't the figure from the mirror. It wasn't the darkness. It was the woman, the one who had tried to warn them. She was standing just beyond the fog, her hands outstretched, her eyes wide with a quiet desperation. "Run!" she cried, her voice clear and strong. "Don't look back. Trust yourself. Trust who you are." Elias blinked, trying to focus on her through the haze of shadows. For a moment, it was as if everything paused. The fog stopped moving, the voices faded into silence, and the mansion itself seemed to hold its breath. The woman stepped closer, the light around her flickering like a fading star. She was real. She had to be. She wasn't a reflection. She wasn't a trick of the mirror. "You can leave. You don't have to stay here." Her voice was full of purpose, like a call to action. "You can break free. The house cannot keep you." Elias's chest tightened. The figure in the mirror still waited, still watched, its empty eyes piercing through the fog, but they couldn't look away from the woman. Her presence was a beacon of something good, something real, something that could pull them away from the suffocating darkness. They stepped toward her, moving against the tide, defying the voice, the figure, the house. "Trust yourself." The woman's voice echoed in their mind one last time, a final plea. Elias reached out for her, their fingers brushing against the light she emitted, and for the first time, they felt a sense of clarity. The pull of the house grew stronger, but Elias felt something inside them shift, a part of them that had been lost for so long, a piece of themselves they had tried to outrun, now rising to the surface. The house had fed on their fear, on their regrets, but this time they were stronger. They were more than their past. With a final surge of will, Elias stepped forward, their body trembling, but their resolve unshakable. The light around the woman flared brighter, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the mansion seemed to pause, as if it were waiting for them to make the final decision. They made it. The figure in the mirror screamed in rage, its form twisting and distorting into something unrecognizable, but Elias was already moving. The ground beneath them began to shake, the world around them warping again, but the light from the woman's hand pulled them forward, and with one final breath, Elias stepped into it, and then everything went dark. The world felt like it was falling away. Elias's body, though exhausted and trembling, was suspended in a strange weightlessness, as if time itself had slowed to a standstill. The ground had disappeared beneath them, the earth gone, the air gone, leaving them floating in an endless expanse of nothingness. For a moment, there was no sound, no sense of direction, just a thick, suffocating silence. Elias couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was nothing but the sensation of being drawn, pulled forward by some unseen force. They were being tugged, dragged, through an endless sea of darkness. It wasn't like the fog from the mansion, or the shadows that had haunted them in the study. This darkness was cold, empty, and yet it seemed alive, pulsating like a heartbeat. It felt like they were being stretched through it, as though it were a liquid, wrapping around them, trying to pull them back, pull them into its embrace. But then, just as the sensation of falling seemed like it would swallow them whole, there was a shift, a ripple in the air, like the sudden break of light in an otherwise pitch-black night. The cold darkness seemed to recede, replaced by a flicker of warmth, a feeling of movement, a strange pull towards something alive. The next thing Elias knew, they were standing on solid ground again. The weightlessness was gone, and the feeling of being drawn into the darkness had dissipated. They opened their eyes. Everything was different. They were standing in a vast open space, bathed in a soft, golden light. The air around them felt strangely clean, almost healing, as though they were breathing for the first time. The land before them was alive, alive in a way that the mansion had never been. The ground was warm, not cold and decayed like the mansion's floor. The earth felt full of potential, like it had been waiting for something to bloom, to break free. Flowers and grasses swayed gently in an invisible breeze, their colors more vivid than any Elias had ever seen. The sky above was clear, the soft golden light spilling across everything, but it wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warm, comforting. This place felt safe, like they had stepped into a world beyond their wildest imagination. There was no darkness, no creeping fog, only this gentle light that bathed the land. And in the distance they could see towering trees, their branches high and strong, their leaves whispering in the soft wind. But what caught Elias's attention most was the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the twisted form of the one from the mirror, the one they had fled from. This figure was different. The woman who had called to them, the one who had tried to guide them, was standing a few paces away, waiting with her hands outstretched, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Elias, you made it." Her voice was calm, gentle, and though it had the echo of a faraway dream, there was a depth to it, a recognition. She knew them, knew their struggle, and despite the overwhelming sense of disorientation, Elias felt the familiarity of her presence. There was something undeniably comforting about her, as though she had always been there, watching, waiting for the right moment to call them forward. "Where am I?" Elias asked, their voice hoarse, still shaken by the intensity of everything that had just happened. "What is this place?" They looked around again, taking in the surreal beauty of the landscape, the way the light seemed to dance in the air, the sense of peace that surrounded them. But even in the stillness of this new world, a part of them still felt on edge. They could still hear the whispers of the mansion, the deep, resonating voice of the figure, the one they had escaped from, echoing faintly in the corners of their mind. "This is where all things converge," the woman said, her voice like a soft breeze that soothed their restless thoughts. "This place, it's not just somewhere out there. It's inside you, Elias. It's a part of you. This is the world of the unmade. A place where the things you have left behind, the parts of yourself you buried or forgot, go when they are no longer a part of the world you live in." Elias blinked, confusion clouding their mind. "Unmade?" They took a hesitant step forward, still processing the words, the meaning of everything she was saying. "What do you mean? This isn't real. It can't be. The house, the figure, it was real. It was there. It was inside me, part of me." Their voice cracked with the weight of the truth that was starting to settle in. The woman nodded. "Yes, it was part of you. The mansion, the mirror. It was never just a place, Elias. It was the manifestation of the choices you didn't make, the regrets you held onto for far too long. The figure. It was your shadow, your reflection of the person you feared you could become if you stayed lost in the past. The more you fed into those fears, the more real it became, until it was no longer just a part of you. It became a presence, something that took root and grew." Elias felt a chill settle in their chest. The house, the mirror, the figure, it had all been inside them. They had created it. "And this place," they murmured, looking around once more, "this is where all the things I left behind go." The woman's smile softened. "Yes, this is the place where the unmade reside, the versions of you that never existed, the parts you left behind. This world is full of those lost parts. They aren't good or evil, right or wrong. They're simply pieces of you that you couldn't carry with you, pieces you couldn't reconcile." The words settled heavily on Elias's chest. The realization was overwhelming. They had been running from themselves, from the versions of themselves that could have been, the version that had fled, the one that had drowned in fear and regret, the version that had given in to the mirror's call. They swallowed hard, their throat tight with emotion. "So, I've been running from myself all this time." Their voice shook with the weight of the revelation. The mirror, the figure, it wasn't some external force. It had been a part of their own mind, their own consciousness, a creation of the fears and choices they had buried. The woman nodded. "Yes, but that doesn't mean you've lost yourself. You've just been distracted, running in circles, never quite allowing yourself to step forward. But now you have the chance to make a choice, the choice to leave behind those pieces of you that you don't need, the choice to embrace who you truly are." Elias felt a strange sensation ripple through their chest, something like relief, but also like a door opening inside them. It was a feeling of being whole, of no longer needing to fight the versions of themselves that had once seemed too much to bear. For the first time, they felt like they could finally breathe. "What happens now?" they asked, their voice steadier, now though still filled with the remnants of fear. "What do I do now?" The woman's smile deepened, her eyes reflecting a kindness that Elias had never known before. "Now, you move forward. You don't have to carry your past with you anymore. You are free. You have the choice to leave behind everything that has held you back, everything that has defined you by your mistakes. You can create something new. Elias felt the weight lift from their shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like they could walk without the burden of their past. The unmade world had given them a gift, freedom. But even as they stood in the warmth of this new light, the distant sound of the mansion's voice still echoed faintly. The figure had not disappeared. It was still there, a shadow just beyond their thoughts, but it had lost its power. The woman reached out, gently guiding Elias forward, away from the light that still flickered faintly in the distance. "Come, leave it behind. It no longer holds you." Elias stepped forward, their heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. The house was no longer in pursuit. They were free to step into the light, to create something new, a life where they would choose themselves. The warmth of the light surrounded Elias like a soft embrace, steady and constant. For the first time, they felt as though they could truly breathe, as if they were stepping out of the shadow of their own fears into something new, something far less complicated. The distant whispering of the mansion faded with each step, like the echoes of a long-forgotten dream. The woman's presence beside them was reassuring, like a gentle guide, urging them forward through this strange new world. Her hand was warm, her grip steady, and as they walked, Elias noticed something remarkable. The further they moved away from the edge of the clearing, the more the landscape shifted. The air around them began to hum with life, a low, steady pulse that made the world feel alive, breathing in harmony with them. Ahead of them, the path stretched out into a forest of towering trees. The trunks were thick and sturdy, their branches intertwining above like protective arms, casting dappled light onto the forest floor. The grass underfoot was soft and thick, and every step they took seemed to sink into the earth, as though the land itself welcomed them. The sound of birds, real birds, their songs clear and pure, filled the air, a far cry from the haunting silence of the mansion. Elias felt a strange sense of wonder, the fear that had once clenched their chest now, replaced with something else, curiosity. This was no longer a world of shadow, of reflections and mirrored truths. This was something real, something they could touch and feel and become part of. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt hope. "Where are we going?" Elias asked, their voice soft, unsure, but filled with an unspoken question. They had no idea where this place led or what it would bring, but the question was more than just a direction. It was a question about themselves, a question about what they could become, about what this journey could give them. The woman smiled warmly, as though she knew exactly what Elias was thinking. Her eyes, though kind, held a depth that spoke of ages, of wisdom gained from knowing what it meant to truly live. She didn't say anything at first, allowing the question to settle between them, before she finally spoke, her voice like a soft breeze. "Where we go now," she began, "is wherever you choose to go. This place," she swept a hand toward the expansive, rolling landscape around them, "is where you can finally be free of the limitations you've placed on yourself. There is no boundary here, no judgment. There is only possibility." Elias took in her words, trying to understand them, trying to feel what they meant in the context of this strange new world. The mansion had been a place of confinement, of mirrors and shadows that trapped them in a prison of their own mind. The mirror had shown them not just the life they had chosen, but also the lives they had abandoned, the paths they had not walked. The house had become a prison, a place of endless mirrors reflecting endless versions of themselves, until they couldn't tell which one was the real version anymore. But this place, this world, was different. There was no mirror here, no reflections, only the raw, unfiltered truth of what was. Elias stopped for a moment, eyes drifting to the sky. The golden light above them wasn't blinding, nor harsh, but gentle, as though it were part of the earth itself, rising from the ground and pouring into the sky. The colors in the air were softer here, the edges blurred as though the world existed in a dream, but a dream that felt more real than anything Elias had ever known. "I don't know what to do," Elias confessed softly, their voice cracking just slightly, unsure of how to move forward. "I've been running for so long, away from everything, from myself." The woman nodded, understanding. "And you've carried that burden with you for so long, haven't you? The weight of regret, the fear of who you are, of what you could become. But you have to understand, Elias, you are not bound by your past." She turned toward them fully now, her gaze full of something almost maternal. "You can choose." Elias looked at her, the words sinking into their soul like a seed being planted in fresh soil. They had always thought they were trapped by the choices they had made, that those choices would define them forever. But here, in this place, there were no chains. There was no mirror to reflect back their mistakes. There was only the future, and that future was theirs to build. Elias trailed off, feeling the weight lift from their shoulders. The fear, the heaviness that had plagued them for so long was gone. It wasn't just fading, it was disappearing altogether. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I know how to live without that fear, without the mirror." The woman reached out and gently touched Elias's shoulder, her fingers warm, solid. Her voice was calm, a steady reassurance. "You don't have to know right now, Elias. You've already made the first choice, to be free. And with that, the rest will follow. It always does." Elias closed their eyes, feeling the weight of her words sinking deep into their bones. Be free. For the first time, they felt the truth of it. It was like a door opening in their mind. The world no longer felt like an enemy, no longer a place of reflection or regret. It felt like a canvas, untouched and full of potential. They didn't have to look back. They didn't have to keep running. There was no mirror to reflect them, no shadow to haunt them. There was only the possibility of what they would choose to become. "You're right," Elias whispered, a smile tugging at the corner of their lips. "I don't have to know. I just have to move forward." And for the first time in years, Elias took a step forward, not as someone fleeing from themselves, but as someone walking toward who they could truly be. The woman smiled at them, and together they continued down the path. The world stretched before them, a wide-open expanse of light and possibility. As they walked, Elias began to realize that this was only the beginning. The mirror had shown them who they could have been, but it was this place, this new world, that would show them who they could truly become. Ahead of them, the forest opened up to a meadow where the soft hum of nature filled the air, an invitation, a welcome to something new. And Elias stepped into it, no longer bound by their past, but free to create a future of their own choosing. With every step, the light grew brighter, and the world seemed to sing a soft, harmonious tune, welcoming Elias home. The meadow stretched out before them, a vast and open expanse of golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. Elias's steps felt light, almost as if the earth itself was supporting them, as though the weight of the world had been lifted, leaving them with nothing but the soft hum of life in the air. The path that had once felt so unclear, so full of barriers, now seemed wide open, like a door flung open into the sun. As they walked alongside the woman, Elias began to take in the details of the world around them. Colors bloomed with a vibrancy they had never known before. The grass was impossibly green, the sky above them a perfect, endless blue. The trees at the edges of the meadow, towering and strong, swayed gently in the wind, their leaves shimmering with an iridescence that seemed to hold the light itself. The air was warm, but not oppressive, crisp but not cold, just right. It felt alive, but in a way that wasn't overwhelming. It was as though the earth itself was breathing alongside them, the very soil beneath their feet rich with possibility. Every sound in the distance, birds singing, the soft rustling of leaves. The hum of insects sounded like music. It was a peacefulness they hadn't known in so long, and yet it wasn't a silence that weighed on them. It was a freedom. They walked, the woman guiding them with a gentle, knowing presence. Elias noticed as they moved forward that the path before them was no longer defined by edges or borders. There was no line to follow, no marker to suggest the way. Instead, the world shifted around them, moving in a way that felt organic, fluid. They could feel it, a connection not just to the earth but to the air, the sky, and every element that surrounded them. They felt part of it all. "Where are we going?" Elias asked again. But this time the question wasn't full of fear or uncertainty. It was curious, soft, as though they were asking about a place they already knew was waiting for them. The woman smiled, the kindness in her gaze like a beacon of calm. "Wherever you choose, Elias," she said, her voice flowing like a calm river. "This world is yours. You no longer need to be afraid of the choices you made or didn't make. Here, you have the power to create the path you will walk." The weight of her words landed on Elias, but it wasn't a burden. It was something much more profound, something freeing. They had lived their life always being weighed down by the choices they had made and the paths they had never walked. The fear had kept them in the past, held them in a world of regret, where the mirror had reflected only the lives they had abandoned. The idea of freedom, of creating, felt foreign, impossible, and yet here it was, beckoning them. "What if I don't know what to do?" Elias asked, their voice still uncertain, though the tremble in their chest was no longer from fear. It was from something else, something real. "What if I don't know what I'm supposed to be?" The woman turned to face them fully, her eyes filled with compassion. "That's okay, Elias. You don't have to have all the answers. You're not supposed to. What you're supposed to do now is just live. Live without the weight of expectation, without the chains of what you think you should be. All you need to do is keep moving forward, keep choosing." The clarity of her words washed over Elias like cool water, refreshing and liberating. They had spent so long running from the person they feared becoming, from the choices they hadn't made, that they had forgotten the simple truth. They had the power to create their own future. The weight of all those past choices, the missed opportunities, the roads not taken, began to feel lighter, as if the world itself was shedding its burden alongside them. They continued walking, the earth beneath their feet soft but solid, grounding them as they made their way through the meadow. Time seemed to slow here, not in the oppressive way it had in the mansion, where each moment dragged on, but in a way that made the present feel precious, as though the weight of every moment was both infinite and fleeting. The air felt rich, with potential, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to step forward into the life they were meant to live. As they walked, Elias's mind began to drift, slowly letting go of the fear and the confusion. They had been so used to living in the shadow of their past, running from it, constantly wondering if they had made the right choices. But now, here, in this place, there were no more shadows. There was only the present, and the realization that they could choose. They could shape the future however they saw fit. The idea felt so strange and so new. The woman spoke again, breaking the silence that had enveloped them. "In this place, Elias, there are no mirrors, no reflections of what could have been. There is only what is, what will be. Elias stopped, walking, turning to face her, the realization finally dawning on them. So, the mirror, they whispered, the words catching in their throat. It's gone. The woman nodded. The mirror was never really a part of you, Elias. It was a construct of your own mind, a creation of your fears, your regrets. But here there are no mirrors. Here there is only you. A wave of something indescribable washed over Elias. For the first time, they felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that wasn't tied to some distant future or an impossible dream. It was a hope rooted in the present, in the now. Do you remember the choice you made, Elias? The woman asked, her voice soft and patient but filled with purpose. The one that brought you here, the one that helped you break free? Elias closed their eyes, letting the question settle in their mind. It was a question they hadn't allowed themselves to ask before. The choice. They had been so wrapped in the idea of the choices they hadn't made, the regrets, the unchosen paths, that they had never truly understood the choice they had made to step into this world, to leave behind the mansion, to let go of the mirror, to run towards something new. I chose, Elias whispered, their voice trembling with the weight of it, but also with release. I chose to leave behind the past, to stop being afraid of what I could have been. I chose to believe that there's more to me than just the life I left behind. The woman smiled, the expression full of pride, as though she had known all along what Elias was capable of. Exactly. And that is the power you carry with you now. The power to choose again. The power to shape the future, to be who you want to be. Without fear. Elias felt a deep sense of peace wash over them, a stillness that seemed to fill every corner of their being. The mansion, the figure, the mirror, they were all gone. This was not a place of regrets or unmade decisions. This was a place of freedom, where the past no longer had a hold on them. The future stretched out before them, open, full of promise. And for the first time, Elias understood the true meaning of freedom, not from external forces, but from the self-imposed chains of fear and doubt. The woman reached out and placed her hand gently on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of connection, of warmth. You are not defined by the past, Elias. You are free to write the next chapter of your story, and the world is waiting. Elias nodded slowly, their heart light, their spirit unburdened. The mirror had no power here. They were free. And the journey, the real journey, was just beginning. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the meadow in a soft golden light that seemed to pulse with life, giving everything in its reach a warmth that was almost tangible. Elias felt the light on their skin, the weight of it settling into their bones, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they could feel themselves breathe freely, with no chains, no shadows holding them back. The woman, still by their side, smiled warmly, as though she'd been waiting for this moment all along. But Elias knew it wasn't just her smile they were seeing. It was the smile of a part of themselves that had been locked away for so long, the true self that had been buried under years of fear, regret, and unmade choices. The smile was not just hers, it was the one they had been hiding from for so long, the one they were finally ready to embrace. What happens now? Elias asked, their voice steady but filled with curiosity. The question had been hanging in the air for a while, but now it felt different, like the answer was finally within reach, and they were ready for it. The woman's gaze softened, the corners of her lips still curved upward in that knowing, patient smile. Now, she said, her voice full of quiet power. Now you are free to create, to live. She paused, letting the words settle in. You've let go of the past, Elias. You've broken free from the chains of what you thought defined you. The future is yours now. It always was. Elias stood still for a moment, letting the magnitude of what she said wash over them. The past, the house, the mirror, the figure. It was all behind them. They had made their choice to step forward, and in doing so, had crossed a threshold that opened up not just this world, but every possibility within it. The weight that had once clung to them, the suffocating fear, the questions that had clouded their thoughts, had all fallen away. It was as if the land around them had absorbed the heaviness, taking it all in so that they could be light, free to move forward. Elias closed their eyes for a moment and listened. They could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the soft songs of birds perched on the branches above. It wasn't the eerie silence of the mansion, nor the quiet hum of the mirror's waiting voice. It was real, organic, full of life. The land was breathing, the air alive with the presence of everything that existed here. This place, the one they had found themselves in, wasn't an escape. It was the beginning of something new. But how to begin? The question lingered, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an invitation. Elias turned toward the woman, feeling a strange sense of peace in their heart. "But how do I choose now?" they asked, the question still carrying a tinge of doubt, even as they knew that doubt was no longer an obstacle but a small part of the journey. The woman smiled again, her eyes filled with something like understanding, like she knew the truth, knew the answer before it had even fully formed in Elias's mind. "You already have," she said softly. "The moment you walked away from the mirror, you chose. The moment you stepped forward into this place, you chose. There is no right or wrong choice, Elias. There is only your choice, the one that feels true to you." Elias's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. The idea that they could simply choose, that the decision was already within them, was like a revelation. They had spent so much of their life trying to answer questions that had no real answers. The mirror had shown them the endless possibilities of what they could have been, but it had never shown them the one thing that truly mattered, the choice to be who they were meant to be. And now, standing in this place, Elias understood. They had already made the most important choice: to be free, to stop running, to stop hiding from who they were and what they were meant to become. A soft breeze lifted the strands of their hair, the wind carrying with it the scent of fresh earth, flowers, and something indescribable, the scent of possibility. It was all around them, in everything, in every sound, in the very ground beneath their feet. This was the beginning. Elias turned away from the woman, feeling a strong impulse to move. The road ahead of them, the path that had once felt endless and daunting, no longer seemed impossible. The world stretched before them like a canvas, blank and infinite, waiting for them to fill it with their own story. They took a step forward, feeling the earth beneath them, warm and solid, grounding them in a way they had never felt before. They didn't know where the path would lead, didn't know exactly what it would hold, but they no longer needed to. The journey was theirs to shape. They had already chosen to be a part of it. Behind them, the woman followed, walking in step with them. As they walked, Elias couldn't help but notice that the landscape seemed to change with every step they took. The world shifted, adjusted itself to their presence. Trees rose higher as they passed, their branches reaching up to the sky, while flowers bloomed in their wake, petals opening like the sun greeting the dawn. The land responded to them, to their choices, to the light they carried within them now. They felt alive, in a way they had never known before. The old fears, the old doubts, the old regrets, they were gone, leaving space for something new. They passed a small clearing, where a stream wound through the grass, its water sparkling with the same light that had filled the sky. A feeling of peace settled over Elias as they stopped for a moment, kneeling down to touch the cool water. It was clear and pure, free of the pollutants of fear and regret. This was the water of the future, flowing freely and unimpeded. Elias could feel it in their fingers as they touched the water, as it reflected the sky above. This world, this place, it was full of potential, of everything yet to come. The woman stood beside them, watching quietly. Elias looked up at her, a smile breaking across their face. It was the first time in so long that they had no questions, no doubts. They had been given the gift of choice, the gift of now. This place, Elias murmured, standing up, their voice full of awe. It feels like it's all part of me. Like I'm not just here in the world, I am part of the world. I am whole. The woman nodded, her smile deepening. That's the truth, Elias. You were always part of this world. You just needed to see it, feel it. And now, you have the freedom to walk through it as your truest self. This world doesn't define you. You define it. Elias took a deep breath, looking around once more at the landscape, at the life around them. There were no walls, no barriers, no limits. Just open space, open sky, and the freedom to choose. And with each step, Elias knew the truth. They were free. Free to create. Free to live. And in that freedom, they finally understood that the future had always been waiting for them. Not in some distant, far-off place, but right here, in the present, in the choices they were making right now. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon, Elias and the woman walked together side by side. Their journey had just begun, and the world around them was full of endless possibilities. And in that moment, Elias knew something else. The past would never control them again. The future was theirs to shape, and they were no longer running. They were living.